Welcome back to Audible Archives. I'm Nayara, your host, and tonight we step into a turning point in the Mistwoven saga. Dormiria's barriers are failing, nightmares spill into the waking world, and Reverie, once only a dreamer, must rise as a reluctant leader. Tested by allies, hunted by the Harbinger, and tempted by the Abyss itself, every choice will either save their realm or shatter it forever. This is Mistwoven Legends, the fractured dreamer, written by Raul and narrated by Nayara. Before we begin, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because here, every whisper of fate carries weight. Chapter 1: The cracks in the veil. The once steady pulse of Dormiria's dreamscape had begun to waver. Reverie could feel it in every flicker of the barrier that separated their world from the waking chaos. There were whispers in the air, soft as a breath, but laden with the weight of dread. The protective barriers, which had held Dormiria together for as long as Reverie could remember, were cracking. The ripples of this fracture extended outward, disturbing the delicate balance that had long been maintained between dreamers and the dreamscape. Reverie stood at the edge of the great dream spire, the tower that served as both their sanctuary and a watchtower over the realm. The horizon, once a soft and tranquil blend of pastel hues, now bled with jagged streaks of shadow, as if the very fabric of the dreamscape was unraveling at the seams. The air felt heavy, charged with an ominous energy, as though the dreamers' collective fears had coalesced into something tangible, something that could no longer be ignored. Something's wrong, Reverie muttered to themselves, a shiver creeping down their spine as they focused their senses. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a disturbance, a presence. They could feel it, faint but unmistakable, pressing at the edges of their awareness. The abyssal resonance, a familiar sensation that had once been their curse and their gift, pulsed within them like a restless heartbeat. There was no mistake. The barrier was weakening, and the dreamscape was growing unstable. But why? And how? Reverie had felt the power of the Harbinger of Waking before, but this felt different. The Harbinger's influence had always been contained, isolated to the waking world. Yet now, it seemed as if the Harbinger was reaching into Dormiria itself, unraveling the very threads of the dreamscape. Reverie turned their gaze inward, searching for answers within the recesses of their own mind. The Abyss had been a constant companion, its resonance a reminder of their past, but it had always remained a part of them, something they had learned to control. But now, it felt different, more insistent, as if the Abyss itself was reacting to something far more powerful than it had before. Their thoughts scattered as the first of the cracks appeared in the sky, a thin, jagged rift that sliced through the heavens. It wasn't the first, but it was the largest. Reverie had no choice but to watch as the crack expanded, a dark force seeping through the opening. The dreamscape trembled, as though a great weight had suddenly settled upon it. Reverie knew they needed to act fast. If the Harbinger's influence continued to spread, Dormiria would not survive. Worse, the waking world would become a part of the nightmare, and the delicate boundary between the two would cease to exist. They had to understand the cause of this shift, and fast. Reverie, came the voice of Arindra, breaking through the silence. Reverie turned to find the Dreamweaver approaching, his brow furrowed with concern. The council has convened. They need you. Reverie nodded, though their thoughts were already elsewhere. The cracks in the veil were only the beginning. What they didn't know was that the true nature of the disturbance was far more complex than any of them could have anticipated. Arindra led Reverie through the winding halls of the Dream Spire to the council's chambers, where the high-ranking Dreamweavers had gathered. The air inside was thick with tension, and the weight of their unease hung over the room like a storm cloud. Reverie felt it, too, the uncertainty gnawing at the edges of their consciousness. Everyone had sensed it, the shift the trembling of the barriers. But no one knew the cause, and that frightened them more than they cared to admit. The Dreamweavers turned their gaze toward Reverie as they entered. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, as if the very act of speaking would make the situation worse. The elder Dreamweaver, Celestia, stood at the head of the council. Her eyes, once clear and sharp, now carried the weight of centuries of wisdom and worry. "We have called you here because of your connection to the Abyss," Celestia said, her voice low but steady. "The barriers between Dormiria and the waking world have been weakening for some time, but the cracks have grown worse in recent days. We need to understand what's happening before it's too late." Reverie took a deep breath. They had spent their life walking the fine line between the dreamscape and the abyss, and they knew the delicate balance that held both worlds apart. But something had changed. Something beyond their understanding was pushing through the cracks. "I feel it, too," Reverie replied, their voice tight. "But I don't know what's causing it." "The Harbinger? Do you think it's the Harbinger?" Irinder interjected. His eyes were wary, his hand gripping the back of his chair, as if the mere mention of the name sent a chill down his spine. Reverie paused, their gaze drifting to the ceiling, where the cracks in the veil had begun to shimmer like stars in the dark. "I don't know. The Harbinger has always been confined to the waking world. But this feels different. It's as if something is trying to breach the walls between dreams and reality." Celestia's expression hardened. "The Harbinger is no ordinary force. It thrives on fear, on chaos, on waking minds that cannot distinguish dream from reality. If it has found a way into Dormiria, then it is worse than we feared." Reverie's mind raced. The Harbinger's influence had always been a dangerous force, but it had never before been able to breach the dreamscape. What had changed? What had given the Harbinger this new power? The council members exchanged uneasy glances as Reverie's words sank in. The dreamscape had always been a place of refuge, a realm where the mind could roam free, unbound by the limitations of the waking world. But the cracks in the veil had made that sanctuary feel fragile, as though the very foundation of Dormiria was being eaten away. "We have no choice," Celestia said, her voice resolute. "We must investigate these cracks further. You, Reverie, are our best hope. Your connection to the abyss may be the key to understanding how this breach is happening." Reverie nodded, the weight of their responsibility settling heavily on their shoulders. They had always known that their connection to the abyss made them different, set them apart from the others. But now, that same connection could be the very thing that allowed them to bridge the gap between the dreamscape and the waking world. "I will find the source," Reverie said, their voice unwavering. "But I need your help. We can't do this alone." Celestia gave a sharp nod. "We will lend our support, but be warned, this is no simple task. The cracks in the veil are not just openings. They are rifts in the very fabric of our existence. Whatever is causing this disturbance, it is not something we fully understand, and if we're not careful, it could consume us all." Reverie knew the stakes. They had faced darkness before, but this felt different. It was as though the very essence of Dormiria was beginning to unravel, and if they didn't act quickly, it could drag everything into the depths of oblivion. The cracks in the veil were just the beginning. Chapter 2, The Weight of Leadership. The dream spire stood tall, casting long shadows over Dormiria's vast, undulating landscape. The delicate glow of the dreamscape flickered uneasily, reflecting the turmoil within Reverie's mind. The cracks in the veil continued to widen, and the voices of the council echoed in Reverie's ears, an unending hum of concern. It felt as though the weight of the entire realm had shifted to their shoulders, crushing them beneath its uncertainty. The council had acted quickly, the urgency palpable. Their whispers of fear and hope had reached Reverie even before they had entered the chamber. As they walked across the cold stone floors, reverberating with each step. Reverie could sense the eyes of every Dreamweaver upon them. It was a subtle thing. The tension in the air, the way everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the lucid whisper to speak. Reverie had always been an observer, watching from the edges, but now they stood at the heart of Dormiria's turmoil, unable to escape their newfound position. I don't belong here, Reverie whispered to themselves, though the words fell deaf to the ears of those gathered around them. They had never sought leadership, never wanted to be at the helm of something so grand. A lucid whisper was meant to be a bridge, a guide for dreamers, not a commander of forces. Yet, despite their inner turmoil, the council had made their choice. They had called upon Reverie to lead the lucid whispers, the protectors of Dormiria and its dreamscapes. It had been a unanimous decision, driven by fear of the unknown and the increasing desperation to protect their world from the growing influence of the Harbinger. You will be our anchor, Celestia had told Reverie, her voice heavy with both authority and sorrow. You are the only one who can understand the abyss and the dreamscapes. You know what it means to walk between worlds. That is why we need you, Reverie. But as Reverie stood before the council, the weight of their responsibility felt like an anchor pulling them under. How could they, someone who had only recently reconciled their past, bear the mantle of leadership? They had already fought to understand their own fractured identity, their past, their place in the dreamscape. Now, they were expected to shape the future of all of Dormiria. Reverie. Arinder's voice broke through the silence of Reverie's thoughts, and they looked up to see him standing just a few steps away, his expression full of both concern and resolve. They are waiting for you, Arinder continued, gesturing toward the assembled council. You need to make your decision. They trust you. They need you. The pressure in Reverie's chest tightened. They looked back at the Dreamweavers, who were waiting for a sign, a word, anything that would show them the path forward. The council members, wise and powerful though they were, had their own limitations. They had always relied on the lucid whispers to bridge the gap between the realms, to be the ones who could traverse both the waking and dreaming worlds without losing themselves. But Reverie was different now, changed, torn between two forces that threatened to consume them. How can I lead them? Reverie asked quietly, though the words were as much for themselves as for Arinder. I am still unsure of myself. I barely understand what I've become. Arinder placed a hand on Reverie's shoulder, grounding them in the moment. You've already proven yourself. The council knows it. They've seen what you're capable of. You've fought the abyss. You've faced the darkness within yourself. You know more about the Harbinger than anyone here. Your strength is not in being perfect. It's in knowing the cost of failure. Reverie sighed, their eyes scanning the chamber. The faces of the Dreamweavers were filled with hope, but also fear. This was not a time for doubt, but the very essence of their new role was steeped in it. The cracks in the veil, the growing presence of the Harbinger, it was all a reminder that the stakes were higher than ever before. The council had decided on Reverie's leadership, but the path was fraught with uncertainty. They felt like an outsider in their own position, unsure of the next move, unsure of whether they even had the right to lead. I am not like the others, Reverie muttered, more to themselves than to Arinder. I don't think like them. I don't lead like them. Arinder's gaze softened. That's the strength you have, Reverie. You lead in your own way, not in the way others expect. You understand the darkness in ways no one else can. You know what it means to fall and to rise again. For a long moment, Reverie stared at the council, the weight of their words settling in. The position they were being thrust into was not one they had asked for, but the dreamscape needed someone who understood the complexity of the abyss, someone who could navigate the fragile balance between light and shadow. Reverie had walked that path before. Now, they would have to walk it again, but this time with others relying on them. Finally, Reverie stepped forward, their heart heavy but resolute. The council fell silent, waiting for them to speak. I will lead, Reverie said, their voice steady despite the uncertainty within. But know this, I will lead in my own way. I will not pretend to have all the answers, but I will not abandon Dormiria. I will find the cause of the cracks in the veil and stop the Harbinger from tearing our world apart. We will face this together, but we must trust one another. The words felt like a weight lifted off their chest, though the burden of leadership still lay heavily on them. Reverie had made their choice, but it was a choice filled with fear. They were not ready for this. They may never feel ready for this, but the dreamscape needed them, and for the first time in a long while, Reverie allowed themselves to believe that perhaps they were enough. Later, as Reverie sat alone in the quiet of their quarters, they found themselves reflecting on the gravity of their new role. The vast expanse of Dormiria stretched before them through the open windows, the world they had sworn to protect. The weight of leadership, though necessary, was not something they had ever wanted. It felt like a chain binding them to a destiny they had not chosen. The whispers of the abyss were faint but present, lingering in the back of their mind, like a constant reminder of their past. The connection that had once been a curse now felt like a lifeline, guiding them through the darkness they had only just begun to understand. What had I done? Reverie asked themselves, their voice barely a whisper in the stillness. Their reflection in the window seemed distant, like a shadow of the person they had been. How could they guide others when they still struggled to guide themselves? But deep within, they knew that the time for doubt had passed. The cracks in the veil were not just a symbol of the growing power of the Harbinger. They were a call to action. And as much as Reverie longed for the freedom to simply exist, they knew that Dormiria, and perhaps even the waking world, could not afford for them to stand by. The responsibility was theirs, and they had to rise to it. The weight of leadership was heavy, but it was a burden Reverie had to bear. Whether they were ready or not, they had become the protector of Dormiria's dreamscape. The cracks in the veil had begun, and with them, the uncertain path forward. Reverie would walk that path as a leader, a lucid whisper, and a being torn between light and shadow. Chapter 3: The First Signs of Conflict. Dormiria, once a bastion of harmony between waking and sleeping, began to unravel. The world, a place where dreamers drifted through their subconscious realms, where memories were woven like tapestries, was starting to fray. Reverie stood at the edge of a crumbling precipice, the shimmering borders of Dormiria stretching before them, becoming more opaque and fragmented by the hour. The cracks in the veil, which had once seemed like a distant threat, were now yawning open in full view, allowing the creeping influence of the Harbinger to seep through. The faint whispers that had only grazed the edges of Reverie's mind now surged into the forefront, a constant hum that grew louder with each passing moment. It began with a ripple, a subtle distortion of dreams. At first, Reverie thought they were merely echoes, the effects of their growing responsibility as leader making them overly sensitive to the shifts in Dormiria. But the signs were undeniable. Dreams were twisting, altering in unnatural ways, bending toward darker, more violent manifestations. The peaceful imagery of rolling hills and soft winds became suffused with shadows, figures emerging from the dark corners of the dreamscapes, whispering threats of awakening and chaos. The nightmares were worse. Creatures of nightmare, once banished to the farthest recesses of the dreaming world, were now rising with terrifying frequency. Reverie had always been able to sense when something was amiss in the dreamscapes. Their connection to the realms of dream and wakefulness had always given them a unique ability to perceive subtle changes. But this time, it was different. The fabric of Dormiria itself seemed to be ripping at the edges, and Reverie could feel the fraying threads beneath their feet. It happened on a quiet evening, the stars above Dormiria's sky swirling like a darkened sea. Reverie sat alone in the dream spire, their thoughts a swirling vortex of doubt, and responsibility. When the visions came, they were sharp and sudden, an overwhelming surge of nightmare crashing into Reverie's consciousness like a tidal wave. Reverie's mind raced as the visions unfolded, a chaotic display of shifting horrors that bled into their senses. The first nightmare was grotesque, twisted creatures with hollow eyes and jagged, glowing mouths, their movements unnatural and jerking, as if they were caught in some eternal loop of torment. The creatures were once homeless reflections of the deepest fears of dreamers, but now they seemed to possess intent, malice in their every movement. Reverie gasped as the images flooded their mind. A sprawling city, its towers cracked and bleeding with black ichor. The streets filled with figures who were half dream, half nightmare. The dreamscape was starting to bleed into the waking world. Reverie could feel it. Reality was cracking, becoming less distinct, less secure. The Harbinger's influence was spreading like a disease, infecting every corner of the dream realm. But it was not just the nightmares. The dreamers themselves, those who wandered Dormiria's vast, colorful expanse, had begun to lose their way. Once bright and vibrant figures, now they wandered aimlessly, their minds drifting toward the darkness, caught in the web of the Harbinger's pull. Reverie could feel the weight of their collective fear pressing down on them, as if the entire realm was held hostage by a malevolent force. The balance between dream and waking was slowly tipping, and the chaos that followed was only beginning. Reverie didn't wait for the visions to fully settle before they acted. They reached out, calling upon the Council of Lucid Whispers, summoning them with an urgency that had not been there before. Each of them arrived quickly, their faces a mix of confusion and determination, sensing the disturbance before Reverie even had to speak. Reverie, Celestia greeted, her voice strained with the tension she clearly felt. What's happening? We feel it too, the tremors in the dreamscapes. What is this? Reverie didn't waste time with pleasantries. The Harbinger has made its move, they said, their voice steady, but there was a flicker of uncertainty behind their words. It's starting, distorted dreams, nightmares spilling into the waking world. The barrier is weakening faster than we anticipated. The lucid whispers were silent for a long moment, each of them absorbing the gravity of what Reverie had just said. They had all known that something was wrong, that the veil between the realms was thinning, but hearing it confirmed in such stark terms made the danger all the more real. We need to act quickly, Reverie continued, looking around at their gathered council. The Harbinger's influence will only grow stronger, and if we don't reinforce the veil soon, Dormiria will collapse. We cannot let that happen. There was a quiet murmur of agreement from the others, but Arinder spoke up, his brow furrowed with worry. We can't repair the veil alone, Reverie. The cracks are too large. The Harbinger is pushing through them faster than we can patch them up. We need to go to the source, find out where the power is coming from, and stop it before it destroys everything. I agree, Reverie said, their gaze intense. We need to investigate the heart of the dreamscape, the center of all the realms. It's the only place where we can understand why the barrier is failing. But as they prepared to leave, the atmosphere shifted again. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, and Reverie turned to find that the ground beneath them was beginning to pulse, as if the very foundation of Dormiria was reacting to the growing chaos. They could feel it, a deep, resonating tremor that seemed to call to them, echoing through the very fabric of the dreamscape. We must go now, Reverie urged, the urgency now clear in their voice. The longer we wait, the more this grows. We can't afford to be passive anymore. The lucid whispers moved swiftly, assembling the forces they could muster to protect the crumbling dreamscape. Reverie watched as the group formed into tight, purposeful clusters, each one led by a Dreamweaver who understood the delicate nature of the realms. Reverie, despite their inner doubts, took their place at the front, coordinating the defense from the heart of the action. There was no time to second-guess their ability to lead. Together, they faced the horrors seeping through the cracks in the veil. Nightmares once bound to the shadows now became tangible threats, malformed beasts with glowing eyes and sharp, jagged claws. These were no mere figments of the subconscious. They were creatures of malice, formed from the waking fears of the dreamers, driven by the Harbinger's will. They attacked relentlessly, tearing into the dreamscape and bleeding into the waking world. But Reverie wasn't alone. Harinder fought at their side, his movements swift and deliberate, as always his connection to the dreamscape unwavering. Celestia, with her commanding presence, organized the others, weaving protection spells into the dreamscape's very fabric. But despite their combined efforts, the pressure was relentless. For every nightmare they banished, 2 more took its place. The Harbinger's power was spreading faster than they could contain it. "This isn't just about defense anymore," Reverie said, their voice rising above the battle cries. "We need to take the fight to the heart. We need to find where the Harbinger's influence is strongest and sever its hold on Dormiria." With determination fueling their steps, Reverie led the charge, and the lucid whispers followed, ready to face the unknown, to confront the very source of the unraveling dreamscape. The battle for Dormiria was just beginning, and with each moment it became clearer. The Harbinger was no longer a distant threat. It was here, in the very fabric of their world, and if they did not act quickly, it would be their doom. Chapter 4 fractured dreamscapes. The once vibrant dreamscapes, where the boundaries between possibility and reality had been fluid, were now contorting into jagged, malformed echoes of themselves. Reverie could feel the change in the air, the very pulse of the dreamscape growing erratic like a sickened heartbeat. Dreams were no longer simple, ethereal experiences. They were being torn apart, distorted, and rewritten by an unseen force, the Harbinger of Waking. It wasn't just a creeping influence anymore. It was a violent assault on the very foundation of the dream world. Reverie stood at the precipice of what had once been a tranquil sea of mist, now transformed into an ominous storm of dark, swirling clouds. The dreamscape had begun to shudder with unnatural force, as if the very fabric of creation was being pulled in all directions. What had once been serene visions of beauty, rolling hills bathed in golden light, gentle rivers winding through verdant forests, were now twisted and malformed. In their place, gaping chasms opened into nothingness, and the once safe, comforting landscapes were now battlegrounds for the chaotic energy the Harbinger unleashed. It wasn't just distortion. It was distraction, rewriting the very nature of the dreams themselves. Reverie could feel it in their bones as the dreamscapes cracked and bled. The first time Reverie truly understood the depth of the Harbinger's power came in the form of a single, shattered dream. It had been a simple, peaceful dream, one of the countless creations Reverie had woven for the dreamers to ease their minds. A dream of a child standing in a lush field, chasing butterflies in the warm light of dawn. But when Reverie attempted to navigate into that dream, something was wrong. The dream had been violently altered, its edges frayed, and its essence ripped out of shape. At the center of the field, the child had vanished, replaced by an enormous, writhing shadow. The butterflies had transformed into dark, twisted creatures, fluttering with jagged wings that snapped like the sharp edges of broken glass. The wind that had once whispered sweetly now howled like a furious storm. Reverie felt a pull deep within the dream, a force urging them toward the heart of this dissonance. It was there, at the center of the field, that they felt it, the signature of the Harbinger's influence, corrupting the dream from within. The dream itself began to bleed away, dissolving into fractured shards, scattering into the void. Reverie tried to hold it together, reaching out to stabilize the dream, but the power of the Harbinger was too much. The dream had been rewritten, and there was nothing Reverie could do to restore it. It was no longer a place of joy. It was a battlefield of suffering and destruction. Shaken, Reverie withdrew, realizing the full extent of the threat. The Harbinger was not simply correcting the dreams. It was actively rewriting them, replacing what was once a source of peace with chaos and fear. What was once a refuge for the dreamers had become a war zone, and Dormiria's fragile walls were being shattered by the sheer force of this attack. Reverie could feel the weight of the burden pressing down on them. As a lucid whisper, their role was to weave and maintain the delicate balance between the waking world and the dreamscapes. But now, the very fabric they had once effortlessly shaped was unraveling before their eyes, and the threads of control were slipping from their grasp. In the past, the task had been one of subtlety, guiding dreams, stitching together fragments of thought and emotion into cohesive stories for the dreamers. But now, the dreamscapes needed a different kind of leader, someone who could act swiftly and decisively to restore order to a rapidly disintegrating realm. The Lucid Whispers, once a group of dreamweavers who simply nurtured the dreams of others, were now called upon to be warriors, defenders of a realm on the brink of collapse. Reverie knew that this was the true test of their abilities, not as a leader of the Lucid Whispers, but as a dreamweaver, a weaver of the very dreamscape. They could no longer simply sit back and observe the chaos. They had to actively reshape the collapsing dreamscapes, restoring balance and harmony wherever the Harbinger's correction had taken root. But to do this, they needed to understand the nature of the distortion, to trace the lines of correction to their source. Reverie began to explore the depths of the dreamscapes more carefully, delving deeper into the worlds that were slowly being consumed by the Harbinger's power. As they moved through the fractured realms, they encountered more and more dreams in various stages of collapse. Some were barely distorted, familiar scenes that had only begun to warp. Others were far worse, entire dreamscapes consumed by dark tendrils of destruction, their very existence being rewritten into horrors too grotesque to describe. It was here that Reverie first encountered a new kind of nightmare, one that wasn't just a dream distorted by fear, but a dream actively being erased. These dreams weren't simply turning into twisted versions of themselves. They were being unwoven, thread by thread, until nothing remained but a vast, empty void. At the center of each of these vanished dreams stood a figure, shrouded in shadow, their face hidden by a hood. The figure moved like a phantom through the dreamscapes, unraveling everything in their path. Reverie could feel the pull of this figure, a presence that was both familiar and terrifying. It was the Harbinger, at work in the very heart of the dream realm, rewriting and erasing the dreams of the innocent, leaving nothing but darkness in his wake. It was in these moments of quiet reflection that Reverie truly began to understand the depth of their connection to the dreamscape and to the Harbinger's correction. They were not just a passive observer. They were part of the dream's very foundation. As a dream weaver, Reverie was a bridge between the waking world and the dream world, but they were also a key to its stability. The fabric of Dormiria relied on the weaver's ability to shape the dreamscapes, to mend the cracks before they turned into rifts. But the corruption they faced now was different. It was not something they could simply weave around or contain. The very essence of the dream was being rewritten, and Reverie could feel the strain on their own mind as they worked to keep up. Every attempt to restore balance felt like trying to hold back an unstoppable tide. The nightmares, the distortions, they were not random, not the result of simple fears. They were the direct consequence of the Harbinger's power, an organized force bent on breaking the dreamscape from within. Reverie's mind raced as they considered the implications. If the dreams were being rewritten, if the Harbinger could alter the very nature of reality within Dormiria, then the dreamscapes themselves would soon collapse entirely. The waking world would bleed into the dream, and the boundaries between them would dissolve, allowing chaos to reign in both realms. The war between dreams and waking would not be a battle fought on the edges. It would consume everything. In the face of these overwhelming challenges, Reverie resolved to take the offensive. The first step was to shore up the defenses, to gather the lucid whispers, and prepare them for a series of counterattacks against the Harbinger's influence. But this wasn't a war that could be won with brute force alone. Reverie needed to reassert control over the Dreamscapes, to stitch together the torn edges before they became irreparable. They turned to the heart of Dormiria, the Dream Spire, where the collective energy of the lucid whispers had once been harnessed to maintain the harmony of the realm. The Dream Spire had become a beacon, a lighthouse in the growing storm. And Reverie knew it was the only place where they could channel the dream energy needed to fight back. But it would require more than just their strength. It would take a united front, a team of Dreamweavers working together to stabilize the fracturing world. As Reverie prepared to lead this effort, they knew that this would be their greatest test. The Harbinger's rewriting of the Dreamscapes was not just a physical attack. It was an assault on the very idea of what dreams could be. But Reverie was no longer just a caretaker of dreams. They were a protector of the balance between worlds, and no matter the cost, they would restore the Dreamscapes to their rightful state. Chapter 5, the Abyssal struggle. The battle to protect Dormiria was escalating at an alarming rate. The once stable Dreamscapes had become war zones, fractured by the Harbinger's relentless assault. As Reverie worked tirelessly to stabilize the collapsing realms, a familiar, terrifying sensation began to stir deep within them, a low hum of dark energy, an echo of the abyss. The abyssal resonance, once a quiet whisper in the back of their mind, was now a thundering presence. Reverie could feel the weight of it pressing against their will, drawing them closer with every passing moment of despair. The energy it offered was intoxicating, raw, primal, and powerful. It was the force that had once been their birthright, the dark power they had rejected so long ago. Now, as Dormiria teetered on the edge of destruction, the abyss was offering them a way to end the conflict swiftly, to obliterate the Harbinger and restore balance in a single, overwhelming stroke. But as tempting as it was, Reverie knew the price of such power. They had seen the correction it could bring, the slow unraveling of the self that came with using the abyss's strength. It was an alluring force, promising victory, but at the cost of everything Reverie had fought to become. The abyss had already tried to claim them once, and each time it beckoned, it pulled them further from the person they had chosen to be. Now, with the entire dreamscape at risk, Reverie found themselves standing at the precipice of a terrifying decision. Reverie stood alone in the heart of Dormiria, gazing out at the war-torn landscape. The sky, once a gentle swirl of colors, had darkened. The dreamscapes that had once radiated with peace and hope were now fractured, twisted under the Harbinger's influence. Reverie felt the ground beneath them tremble, the walls of the dream spire vibrating as if they, too, could sense the growing instability. The abyss whispered to them, a familiar voice in their mind, thick with promise and temptation. You do not need to struggle, Reverie. You do not need to fight. I can end this. I can make them all bow to you, to me. You were born to wield this power. You were born to lead. It was a lie. Reverie knew that now. They had spent so long running from the abyss, rejecting its call, but now it felt different. Now, it was offering them control, the power to end the war with a single thought. The dreamscapes, the lucid whispers, Dormiria, they could all be saved in an instant. Reverie could feel the immense energy, its sheer force almost overwhelming them, begging them to unleash it. For a moment, Reverie closed their eyes, struggling against the pull. The weight of responsibility was immense. Each fractured dream, each soul trapped in the ever-widening chasm of the Harbinger's influence, was a reminder of the stakes. Just one act, they thought, one decisive moment. I can do this. But then, a sharp pang of doubt pierced through them. Reverie could feel the dark tendrils of the abyss curling around their thoughts, trying to suffocate their sense of self. If they succumbed to the temptation, if they lost the abyss's power, would they still be Reverie, or would they be consumed by the darkness, just another puppet of the very force they had sworn to resist? The abyss could give them the power to reshape everything, but it would also take everything from them. You know what you are, Reverie, the abyss murmured again. You are no mere Dreamweaver. You are the instrument of change. And in your haons, the power of destruction is as much a part of you as the light. Reverie's mind raced as they fought to hold on to their identity. The abyssal resonance thrummed through their veins, cold and insistent, whispering promises of power. But deep within them, Reverie knew the truth. The abyss was not a tool to be wielded, it was a force that devoured. It had no care for balance or purpose. It was chaos incarnate, a flood that would drown everything in its wake. I am not a servant of chaos, Reverie thought firmly, gripping their arms as though to steady their shaking hands. I am a protector, a creator. The struggle was not just external, it was internal, a battle between their deepest desires and their truest self. Reverie had spent so long trying to rebuild their sense of identity, rejecting the darkness that had once consumed them. They could not allow themselves to fall back into that abyss. They could not lose themselves to the very thing they had fought so hard to escape. Yet in the quiet moments, as the darkness whispered louder, there was an undeniable temptation. How much easier would it be to simply give in? The abyss offered them the tools they needed to defeat the Harbinger, to save Dormiria and restore order. It would all be so simple, just one use of its power, one last sacrifice of their soul. But then, Reverie remembered their promise. They remembered what they had learned in their journey, that power, unchecked and uncontrolled, was as dangerous as the threat they faced. If they gave in to the abyss, they would be no better than the Harbinger itself. As the pressure mounted, Reverie closed their eyes, forcing their thoughts to calm. The abyss roared in their mind, a tempest of desire and dark promises. But in the heart of the storm, Reverie found the stillness of their true self. They had not come this far to surrender. No, it was a single word, but it was enough. Reverie reached deep within, pulling on the threads of their resolve, strengthening their connection to the dreamscapes and the lucid whispers. They would not be consumed by the abyss. They would not lose themselves. The abyss raged, but Reverie stood firm, grounding themselves in their purpose. They were a protector of dreams, a weaver of light and shadow, and they would not allow themselves to become the weapon they feared. Reverie opened their eyes, and the darkness receded, though its whispers still echoed faintly in the corners of their mind. They knew that the war was not over, but they had made their choice. The abyss could not be wielded without consequence, and it would never be the solution. The path forward lay in balance, restoring harmony, not through destruction, but through creation. Turning their attention back to the dreamscapes, Reverie felt the weight of responsibility press upon them once more. The battle was far from over, and the Harbinger was still out there, wreaking havoc on the realm. But Reverie was no longer tempted by the abyss. They would fight this battle on their own terms, as a guardian of the dreams, not a servant of the dark. They would rally the lucid whispers, strengthen their resolve, and use their true power, shaping and mending the fabric of the dreamscape, no matter how fractured it had become. Chapter 6, The Call for Unity. Reverie stood in the center of the dream spire, the heart of Dormiria's protection. All around them, whispers of doubt and dissent were growing louder. The battle against the Harbinger had drained the dreamscapes, and despite Reverie's tireless efforts to stabilize the realms, cracks in Dormiria's unity were beginning to show. The lucid whispers, once a unified force bound by a shared purpose, were now divided, fractured by fear, uncertainty, and suspicion. Some had come to question Reverie's leadership, especially after the Abyssal struggle. They had seen the pull of the abyss within Reverie, heard the faint whispers that still lingered in their mind. To some, it was a sign that Reverie was no longer fit to lead. They feared that the same darkness that had once consumed Reverie might rise again, corrupting not only the lucid whispers, but the very heart of Dormiria itself. "The power you wield is dangerous," murmured Varela, a seasoned Dreamweaver and one of Reverie's most trusted allies, her voice cutting through the tension that filled the council room. "You speak of balance, but I see the abyss within you. How can we trust someone who still harbors that darkness?" Reverie's gaze met Varela's, but the words felt like a heavy weight pressing down on their chest. They had fought so long to resist the abyss, to prove that they could shape dreams without succumbing to its call. But the whispers were always there, always waiting to drag them back into the depths. "Varela," Reverie began, their voice steady but filled with the strain of the decision they had made, "I have not fallen to the abyss. I rejected its offer, because I understand the price of power unchecked. But I cannot ignore it either. The abyss is a part of me, just as the light is. We cannot simply banish it or pretend it doesn't exist. We must learn to live with it." A murmur ran through the room, but it was unclear whether the whispers were in agreement or disagreement. Reverie could feel the weight of their words settling heavily over the gathering, like a cloud of uncertainty. The room felt colder now, more distant. Some of the lucid whispers were visibly agitated, their eyes flickering with distrust. Others simply remained silent, unsure how to respond to Reverie's confession. "This is no time for internal strife." Alaron, a wise and neutral member of the council, spoke up, his deep voice echoing in the chamber. "We face an enemy beyond our reckoning. The Harbinger grows stronger, and if we cannot unite, we will fall. Dormiria will fall." Reverie nodded grimly, feeling the weight of Oleron's words settle in their bones. He was right. The threat was larger than any division among them. The Harbinger's influence had only increased, and the Dreamscapes were crumbling further with each passing day. The fractured state of the lucid whispers was a liability they could not afford. If they didn't come together, the realm would be lost. "We need unity," Reverie said, their voice low and commanding. "We cannot afford to be divided. The Harbinger is using our fear, our doubts, against us. If we allow this fracture to deepen, it will tear us apart." The council room fell silent. Every eye was on Reverie now, some filled with suspicion, others with longing. The Dreamscape, their world, was on the brink, and it seemed that only Reverie had the power to unite them all. But how? In the days that followed, Reverie sought to address the growing rift within the lucid whispers. They visited each faction, one by one, attempting to mend the broken bonds between their people. But each encounter seemed to yield more resistance than the last. There were those who, like Varela, could not shake the fear of Reverie's abyssal connection. These whispers had once followed Reverie without question, believing in their mission to protect and guide the Dreamscapes. But now, in the face of the growing darkness, their faith wavered. They could no longer see Reverie as the beacon of hope they once had, but as a potential threat, a ticking time bomb of unstable power. Others, however, saw Reverie as the only one who could lead them out of this chaos. They saw their strength, their resilience, and the wisdom they had gained in embracing both light and shadow. These whispers were drawn to Reverie's vision of balance, of using the abyss as a tool, not a master. They believed that the key to defeating the Harbinger lay in embracing both sides of themselves, the darkness and the light. But this faction was smaller than Reverie had hoped, and the longer they took to unite the factions, the more the Dreamscapes slipped from their grasp. The Harbinger's influence spread like an unstoppable tide, rewriting dreams, distorting reality, and sowing fear in the hearts of the dreamers. One night, as Reverie walked through the shifting halls of Dormiria, their mind weighed down by the mounting pressure, they encountered a familiar figure in the shadows, Nayara, the rogue dream thief who had once helped them uncover fragments of their past. Nayara leaned against the doorway, her dark cloak swirling around her. Her eyes glinted with an unreadable expression as she studied Reverie, silently waiting for them to speak. "You're struggling," Nayara said softly, stepping closer. "The factions are splintering, the Harbinger is gaining power, and you're carrying the weight of all of it on your shoulders." Reverie glanced at her, their expression unreadable. "How do you do it, Nayara? How do you keep your focus when everything around you is falling apart?" Nayara's lips curled into a faint smile. "I don't. I let go of the idea of being perfect. You can't lead them if you're too busy trying to be something you're not. Your power, your true strength, comes from accepting what you are. You cannot fix everything alone, Reverie. You must let the lucid whispers decide." "Too." Reverie frowned, conflicted. "I cannot allow Dormiria to fall. I cannot let fear rule us." "And yet, fear is what binds you all together," Nayara replied. "Fear of the abyss, fear of the Harbinger, fear of your own power. The question is not whether you can control your fear, but whether you can let it unite you." Reverie's mind whirled as they considered Nayara's words. Could they let go of their need to control everything, to carry the burden alone? Could they trust the lucid whispers to find unity on their own, despite their doubts? The following day, Reverie called for a meeting of the council, bringing together the fractured factions of the lucid whispers. The weight of the moment hung in the air as Reverie stood before them, ready to make one final appeal for unity. "I know I have failed to bridge the divide between us," Reverie said, their voice steady but laced with the exhaustion of the ongoing struggle. "But I will not stop trying. We cannot allow fear to tear us apart. The Harbinger is an enemy we must face together, or we will fall divided. I will not ask you to follow me blindly, but I ask you to remember what we stand for. We are Dreamweavers, and we hold the power to shape not only dreams but reality itself." They paused, letting the weight of their words sink in. "Our greatest strength lies in our unity. If we do not stand together, if we allow fear to control us, we will lose everything, not to the Harbinger, but to ourselves." The silence that followed was heavy with uncertainty. Reverie could feel the room's resistance, the lingering doubt, but they also felt the shift, the subtle change as the lucid whispers, despite their differences, began to look to each other for strength. And in that moment, Reverie realized something profound. They did not have to lead alone. They had the power to guide, to support, but the real strength came from those they led, from the trust and unity they could help build. Reverie closed their eyes, taking a deep breath. "Let us fight together, or we fight apart. The choice is ours." Chapter 7, The Power Within. Reverie stood in the center of a quiet chamber within the dream spire, the stillness of the room at odds with the storm churning inside their mind. The growing sense of responsibility weighed on them like a heavy cloak, pressing against their shoulders with an unbearable force. The threat of the Harbinger loomed larger every day, but it wasn't just the external darkness that filled Reverie with unease. It was the darkness within. They closed their eyes and extended their hand, palm facing upwards. Around them, the air seemed to ripple, distorting slightly as Reverie summoned the power within. The familiar pulse of dream weaving surged through them, more intense now than ever before. Their connection to the dreamscape had always been strong, but since the crisis began, that connection had deepened, expanded into areas they'd never dared to explore. They had begun experimenting with the very fabric of reality, twisting dreams and shaping them with newfound clarity. a flicker of light appeared above their palm, an orb of pure energy shifting with the colors of dreams. Reverie watched as it morphed and spun, twisting like a star being born, its form delicate yet potent. With a subtle motion of their fingers, they condensed the orb into a shape, a small bird, translucent and shimmering with light. The bird fluttered into the air, hovering for a moment before dissolving into a cloud of sparkling dust. Impressive, Reverie muttered to themselves, the excitement of discovery mingling with the creeping dread in their chest. They could feel it now, the immense power coursing through them. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. The ability to create something so beautiful, so intricate, was a gift, one that few could ever wield. But the potential for destruction, for chaos, was just as real. Reverie's mind flashed to the warning they had given to the lucid whispers just days earlier. The Harbinger would not defeat them if they remained united, but if they allowed fear to take hold, if they let the darkness divide them, then they would fall. They had stood in front of their allies and spoken of unity, of strength in the face of despair. But now, alone in this quiet chamber, the truth was undeniable. The darkness they had fought so hard to contain was alive within them, and it was growing stronger. They closed their eyes again, this time with a more focused intent. Reverie reached deeper, further into the core of their power. They could feel the abyss there, lurking beneath the surface, a dark, pulsating energy full of potential. The pull was undeniable, a whisper in their mind urging them to embrace it fully, to use it without restraint. For a moment, Reverie hesitated, feeling the conflict tear at their spirit. What if they gave in? What if they allowed the abyss to take hold once more, just as it had when they were first created? They could be more than a Dreamweaver. They could be something unstoppable, a force of creation and destruction, capable of reshaping the Dreamscapes however they wished. The temptation was strong, but Reverie fought against it, remembering the darkness that had consumed them once before. The memories of their fall, the days when they had been little more than an instrument of the abyss, flooded their mind. That was a path they had already walked, and one they could never return to. With a deep breath, Reverie released the pull, letting the abyssal energy slip away like sand through their fingers. The power, the whispers, all faded into silence. Reverie opened their eyes, staring at their outstretched hand, feeling both exhausted and relieved. The temptation had been close, but they had not yielded. But the knowledge lingered. They knew now that they were capable of far more than simply shaping dreams. They could destroy just as easily. And as much as they wished to ignore that reality, to believe that they had control, a part of them feared what might happen if they ever lost it. Days passed, and Reverie spent more time experimenting with their abilities. With the pressure of the situation growing, they needed to understand their power, not just to defend Dormiria, but to prevent the Harbinger from exploiting their weaknesses. Every experiment was a step closer to understanding the depths of their own potential. Reverie began to refine their skill, learning to create entire landscapes with nothing more than a thought. The dreamscape, once a chaotic and malleable expanse, was now something they could mold with a precision that almost felt surgical. One day, they stood before a blank canvas of the dreamscape, feeling its raw energy pulsating beneath their fingertips. They closed their eyes and imagined a mountain, a towering, jagged peak that scraped against the clouds. Slowly, with the smallest of movements, Reverie breathed life into the image. Stone, earth, and sky began to form beneath their will, rising into a colossal mountain. The scene felt so real that Reverie could almost feel the cold air sweeping down from the summit, hear the wind howling through the crags. But it didn't stop there. Reverie pushed further, twisting the landscape until the mountain began to crack and crumble. The once solid foundation shattered, rocks falling away like rain, splintering into smaller pieces as the dreamscape collapsed into nothingness. The distraction was swift and beautiful in its own right, a reflection of the chaos that simmered beneath the surface. Reverie gasped, their breath coming in shallow bursts as they looked upon the wreckage of their creation. The power to build was exhilarating, but the power to destroy, so easily, so effortlessly, was terrifying. The days blurred together as Reverie honed their newfound abilities. Every experiment seemed to reveal a new layer of their potential. They could conjure rivers of light, create vast oceans of liquid dreams, or weave forests that sang with the wind. But with each creation, there was always the same underlying truth. Their power was as much a force of destruction as it was a force of creation. It was becoming increasingly clear to Reverie that their abilities were not meant to be wielded lightly. They could reshape the dreamscape with precision, yes, but they could also tear it apart just as easily. In the wrong hands, or under the wrong circumstances, that power could be catastrophic. And that was the crux of it. Reverie's greatest fear was not the Harbinger's influence. It was their own. They feared that, in their desperation to end the conflict, they might lose control and become a weapon of the very darkness they sought to fight. The abyss, always lurking in the background, whispered of freedom, of power unchained. It urged Reverie to embrace the chaos, to let it consume them entirely and become something more. But Reverie had made a vow to never again fall prey to that temptation. Yet the lure was still there, always. The power to destroy, to reshape the world to their will. It was intoxicating. And Reverie knew that, in the heat of battle, in the face of the Harbinger's relentless assault, they might one day face a choice: to use that power to end the fight once and for all, or to hold back and risk everything. As Reverie sat in quiet contemplation, watching the shifting dreamscape before them, they realized something profound. The power they wielded was not simply a weapon, it was a responsibility. Every dream they shaped, every fragment of reality they conjured, had consequences. The balance between creation and destruction wasn't a line, it was a spectrum. And Reverie now stood at the center, caught between those extremes. The true test would not be in defeating the Harbinger or saving Dormiria. It would be in mastering themselves, learning to balance the light and the darkness, the power to create and the power to destroy. They could no longer simply act on instinct. Reverie needed to trust not only in their power, but in their ability to use it wisely. And so, they stood up from their place by the window, eyes set with newfound resolve. The path ahead would be difficult, fraught with temptation and uncertainty, but Reverie understood now, with clarity, what their true purpose was: not to wield their power blindly, but to learn how to control it, to guide it, and to use it for something greater than themselves. The Harbinger would come, and when it did, Reverie would be ready, not just with the power to fight, but with the wisdom to choose when to use it. Chapter 8. The first loss. The dreamscape shimmered uneasily around them, flickering between states of lucidity and chaos. Reverie, their mind sharp with concentration, stood at the center of the shifting dream, attempting to weave the fractured threads back into a stable whole. The task was monumental, even with their growing mastery over dream weaving, and the strain of constant battles with the Harbinger's forces had taken a toll on the dreamscapes. The pressure was suffocating, but Reverie had no choice. Dormiria was on the brink of collapse, and every effort to restore balance felt like a desperate breath before drowning. "Hold steady," Reverie murmured, as their allies, a small group of lucid whispers, worked alongside them to stabilize the dream's foundation. The dreamscape rippled violently as an onslaught of nightmares attacked from the edge, a constant reminder of the Harbinger's relentless advance. The creatures, twisted and malformed, clawed at the edges of the dream with malevolent hunger. Lunny, a trusted ally, and one of the oldest members of the Lucid Whispers, stood at Reverie's side. Their presence had always been steadying, a source of wisdom and unwavering loyalty. Together, they'd confronted many threats before, both the physical and the psychological. But today, Lunny's usual calm was edged with urgency, their movements more frenzied than Reverie had ever seen. "We don't have much time," Lunny called out, their voice tinged with panic. "The cracks are deepening. We need to get to the core before it fractures completely." Reverie nodded, their own heartbeat quickening as they pushed the dream's boundary, trying to strengthen its edges. But the Harbinger's forces were growing, spreading through the dreamscape like an infestation. Every thread Reverie attempted to weave was frayed and torn by the shadow of the enemy. "We can do this," Reverie said, but the words tasted hollow, even to their own ears. The Harbinger's minions, nightmarish entities born from the abyss, bore down on the group, cutting through the dreamscape with brutal efficiency. Reverie focused harder, attempting to bend the dream around them into a shield, but the weight of the effort was too much. Then, amidst the chaos, Reverie felt it, a sudden, terrible tug on their soul, the unmistakable feeling of a presence slipping away. Lunny fell. The lucid whisper crumpled to the ground, their form flickering and fading as the dreamscape twisted violently. Reverie's heart stopped, a hollow, sickening feeling spreading through their chest. The figure of Lunny, so steady and reliable, collapsed in a cloud of dark smoke. Their face, always calm, even in the face of danger, was now contorted in pain. The dreamscape seemed to recoil in horror. "Lunny!" Reverie cried out, reaching for their ally, but it was too late. Lunny's form vanished completely, leaving only a faint echo in the dream's fabric. A cold emptiness settled in Reverie's chest, as if the very core of their being had been torn away. They could not process it. Not Lunny. Not like this. The one person who had always been there, who had seen them through the darkest of times, was gone. The dreamscape around them began to crumble further, destabilizing at an alarming rate. Reverie's mind raced, their thoughts spinning in chaos as they tried to regain control. The task at hand seemed trivial in comparison to the loss that now consumed them. "No," Reverie shouted, voice cracking. "We can't lose this. We can't lose Dormiria." But the words felt empty. The world was slipping from their grasp, and the heavy, stifling silence that followed Lunny's death left them with a haunting sense of guilt. If they had moved faster, been stronger, Lunny would still be alive. The weight of that thought was unbearable. The other lucid whispers around them fought with desperate vigor, but Reverie could feel the fracture in their collective resolve. Lunny's death was a blow to them all, one that Reverie could sense in every hesitation, every faltering step. Reverie called out the familiar voice of Kaelin, another whisper as they approached. There was no comfort in their tone, only grim determination. "We need to retreat. The dream is collapsing. We can't keep fighting like this." Reverie's gaze snapped to Kaelin, but they couldn't respond immediately. The guilt, the deep sense of responsibility for Lunny's death, had paralyzed them. They couldn't pull their mind away from the memory of Lunny's fall, their face now etched in Reverie's mind like a permanent scar. The fear of losing more allies, of failing Dormiria completely, was crippling. Reverie wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but they were too caught in the whirlwind of their own doubts. Had they led their friends into this? Had they, in their desperate attempt to control the dreamscapes, become the reason for this tragedy? "We can't win this alone," Kaelin continued, urgency threading their voice. "You're not alone in this fight. We all—" "I should have done more," Reverie whispered hoarsely, their voice trembling. "I should have protected them. If I had been stronger, Lunny wouldn't be dead." Kaelin's expression softened, though there was an edge of steel in their gaze. Lunny knew the risks. They knew what we were fighting for. None of us are invincible, but we can't give up. We have to keep going for them. For them. Reverie's heart clenched. The weight of Lunny's loss threatened to overwhelm them, but Kaelin was right. They couldn't allow the loss to shatter everything they had fought for. There was still too much at stake. With a painful effort, Reverie turned away from the fading remnants of the dreamscape, the shadow of Lunny's absence hanging heavy in the air. They had no choice but to lead their people forward. Back in the safety of the Lucid Whisper stronghold, Reverie sat alone in a quiet room, the faint glow of the dreamscape outside casting long shadows against the walls. The room, once a place of solace and clarity, now felt like a tomb. They couldn't shake the image of Lunny's face, nor the sound of their name being called out in pain. Lunny's death was a blow that Reverie would carry with them forever. Every decision they made now felt like an attempt to justify the death, to atone for failing Lunny when it mattered most. The whispers of the abyss rose in the back of their mind, mocking them for their weakness. They could end the conflict. They could fix everything if they embraced their darker nature. But the thought of using their abyssal power, of giving in to the temptation, made Reverie's stomach churn. If they went down that path, they risked losing themselves entirely. They had to stay strong. They had to prove that Lunny's death wasn't in vain. And yet, the guilt weighed so heavily on them that Reverie felt it would crush them. The days following Lunny's death were filled with a quiet mourning, but also with an undercurrent of urgency. Reverie found themselves pacing the stronghold, unable to sit still, the loss driving them to seek answers. The dreamscape was unraveling, and they were all that stood between Dormiria and destruction. But at what cost? As Reverie stood before a map of Dormiria, their fingers tracing the delicate lines that separated each dreamscape from the next, they realized something vital. Lunny's death, though devastating, had taught them the importance of their role. They could not afford to let the weight of their guilt pull them under. Lunny had given everything to this fight, just as the rest of them had. They had to honor that sacrifice. With a deep breath, Reverie steadied their trembling hands. They would carry on, for Lunny, for Dormiria, and for the hope of a future where they would never have to face this darkness again. They turned to Kaelin, who stood silently nearby, watching them with an expression that mirrored their own turmoil. "Let's go," Reverie said, their voice steadier now. "We have work to do. We're not done yet." And though their heart still carried the heavy burden of loss, Reverie knew that they would not stop. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 9. A Broken Dream. Reverie stood at the edge of the dreamscape, their hands trembling as they reached out, trying to hold together the crumbling threads of reality. The world around them was a haze of fractured light and dark, a kaleidoscope of twisted images that bled together, bleeding through the thin veil between dreams and reality. The loss of Lunny had shattered something deep inside Reverie. It wasn't just the pain of grief that left them weak, though that alone would have been unbearable. It was the crushing weight of guilt that pressed down on their heart, suffocating them. They had failed Lunny. They had promised to protect their allies, to keep Dormiria safe. Yet, in the end, they had been unable to save the one person who had always stood by their side. Tears burned in Reverie's eyes, but they didn't blink them away. Instead, they let the tears fall, mixing with the sweat that dripped down their forehead. The abyss, ever present in the back of their mind, whispered its tempting call. You could end this. You could take the power, bring the dreamscape back into order. Lunny's death could be avenged. No, forgotten. You have the strength. You only need to embrace it. Reverie's breath hitched. The temptation was overwhelming. Every muscle in their body screamed for release, for the chaos and power the abyss offered. It was so easy to give in, to drown in the darkness and forget the pain. Lunny's absence, the horror of their death, could all be erased. With the power of the Abyss, Reverie could reshape the dreamscape as they saw fit. They could make it perfect, control it completely. No, Reverie's mind screamed, but it was a faint, distant thought, drowning in a sea of despair. For a brief moment, they faltered. They stepped forward, drawn toward the chasm that seemed to call them, toward the infinite darkness that beckoned, offering them a way out. The Abyss lured them closer with promises of peace, of an end to their suffering. The lines between dream and reality thinned even further. Reality itself began to warp. Reverie's surroundings swirled, and the floor beneath them trembled. They could feel the dreamscape itself starting to unravel, the world collapsing in on itself, distorting the memories and the very essence of what they had known. A terrible scream echoed in the distance, but it wasn't from the dreamscape. It was an echo of their own voice, a memory of pain. It was Lunny's voice, a sound that haunted Reverie's soul, begging them to not succumb to the darkness. Reverie closed their eyes, the temptation, so intense it almost felt like a physical weight. They wanted to shut it out, to escape, but the Abyss was everywhere now, clawing at the edges of their consciousness. The boundary between dream and reality no longer made sense. And then Reverie, the voice pierced through the Abyss's whispering tendrils like a blade of light. Kaelin! Reverie opened their eyes, seeing Kaelin standing a few paces away, their expression one of raw desperation. Behind them were the remaining lucid whispers, their faces drawn with concern, their bodies tense with the growing instability of the dreamscape. Reverie, no! Kaelin shouted, voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. You can't do this. Don't give in. The words hit Reverie like a slap, snapping them back to the present, to the horrible truth of the situation. Kaelin's voice was like a lifeline, pulling them away from the precipice. But the Abyss didn't give up easily. Its whispers grew louder, more insistent. You don't have to fight this. Just embrace it. But Reverie's vision was blurred. Their mind felt like it was tearing in two, caught between the abyssal pole and the desire to save those they had sworn to protect. Reverie. Kaelin's voice softened, but it was no less urgent. Listen to me. We need you. Dormiria needs you. We need you to lead us, not as the person you were before, but as the person you are now. We can't lose you too. We can't lose another. The words hit Reverie harder than any blade could. A fresh wave of tears filled their eyes, not just from sorrow, but from something deeper, something more rooted in their soul. The Abyss had always been a part of them, but it didn't define them. It didn't control them. Not anymore. I can't, Reverie choked out, voice breaking. I'm not strong enough. You are, Kaelin insisted. You've always been stronger than you think. You've fought through so much, Reverie. You survived it all. We're with you. You don't have to carry this alone. The room seemed to tremble as the dreamscape around them teetered on the brink of collapse. Reverie's body swayed, caught between the pull of the Abyss and the pull of their comrades. The dark whispers of the Abyss continued to beckon, but Reverie pushed them away, their mind focusing on the truth Kaelin had spoken. You are not alone. With all the strength they had left, Reverie forced themselves to breathe, forcing the abyssal resonance back into its place, not gone, but controlled like a storm contained within a jar. The temptation still lingered, a shadow in the corner of their mind, but it was no longer all-consuming. Thank you, Reverie whispered, looking up at Kaelin with two streaked eyes. I was so afraid I'd lose myself. Kaelin's gaze softened, but there was no time for comfort. We all are Reverie, but we fight together. Now let's fix this. As Reverie's hand reached out toward the dreamscape, once more, the darkness receded, though its shadow still loomed in the background of their mind. They could feel their own power, raw and dangerous, but it was no longer a threat. It was a tool, a weapon to defend, not destroy. With a calmness they hadn't felt in days, Reverie began to weave the dreamscape back together. It wasn't easy. The dreamscape resisted, fought against them, but they no longer faced it alone. The remaining lucid whispers, Kaelin, Nox, Sarah, and the others, rallied around them, lending their strength. Together, they began to stabilize the dream, restoring the fragile balance that held the realms together. And though Reverie knew the battle wasn't over, they had taken the first step toward reclaiming themselves. Luli's death still weighed heavily on their heart, but they would carry it as a reminder, not of failure, but of what they had lost and what they had to protect. The abyss still whispered, but Reverie had found something stronger. The bonds of friendship, loyalty, and a deep, unshakable will to protect what they loved. The fight for Dormiria was far from over, but Reverie was ready. Chapter 10 The Abyss's whisper. The dreamscape was shifting once again. The once harmonious blend of reality and illusion, now fractured and unstable. Reverie stood alone at the heart of it, the ever-present hum of the abyss resonating beneath the surface of their thoughts. The pull was undeniable, a darkness that whispered promises of salvation, if only they would accept it. You could save them. Save Dormiria. The voice was low, seductive, reverberating in the deepest corners of Reverie's mind. No more hesitation, no more weakness. Embrace your power. Reverie's body trembled as they tried to center themselves, focusing on the dreamscape around them, the shifting images of familiar faces and distant realms that were slowly fracturing. The harsh beauty of Dormiria, the shimmering city of dreams, was no longer a place of peace. It had become a battlefield, and every minute spent without action meant another crack in the fragile barrier between realms. You see the truth. The abyss's voice was patient now, coaxing. Your power could restore balance. You could make it right. You could save everyone. All it takes is your surrender. Accept who you are, and they will all bow to your strength. Reverie squeezed their eyes shut, the pressure of the abyssal resonance surging within them. The dark energy thrummed in time with their heartbeat, a constant reminder of the raw, untapped power they had inherited. The abyss was a part of them, a part they had fought to suppress, to control. But now it felt like a chain wrapped around their soul, threatening to pull them under, deeper into the shadow. The world around them flickered. Memories of the past, of the struggles and losses, flashed before their eyes. Luli's death, the pain of their failure to save them. The faces of their allies, friends, people they had sworn to protect. They were counting on Reverie. Dormiria itself was counting on them to lead, to make the right decision. Yet in the silence of their heart, there was the voice of the abyss, persistent and alluring. Everything you've lost, everything you've feared, I can give it back to you. Power, control, the end of all pain. Just take it. Surrender to the abyss. The words echoed, swirling around Reverie's mind like a storm. The promises of the abyss had always been enticing, especially now when the stakes were higher than ever. They knew what the abyss could offer, the ability to rewrite reality itself, to force the dreamscape to bend to their will. It could restore balance, stop the Harbinger's destructive path, and save Dormiria. It could even bring back what they had lost, but at what cost? Reverie inhaled sharply, their thoughts racing. The power would not come without consequences. The more they relied on it, the more they would lose themselves to the abyss. It wasn't just the risk of their humanity slipping away, it was the risk of becoming something worse. A shadow, a creature of destruction, not creation. They had seen it in their past, the remnants of their former self, an agent of chaos, bending dreams and realities to their whims. Reverie's very existence had been born from that darkness, a creation of the abyss itself. They had fought so hard to escape that fate, to become more than what they had been. But now, the choice was before them once again. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Reverie's chest. The dreamscape around them twisted, warping with the emotional intensity of their internal battle. If they didn't act, Dormiria could be lost. If they didn't use the power, the Harbinger would consume everything. The Abyss's voice coiled around their thoughts again, urging them forward, promising them the ultimate freedom, the ultimate strength. You are not like them. You are not like the lucid whispers. You are the one who can reshape this world. Let me help you, Reverie. Give in. They will never understand the burden you carry. Only I do. Reverie's fingers twitched as they fought to suppress the trembling. The power was so close now, so easy to reach for. They could feel the raw energy surging beneath their skin, a wild, untamable force waiting to be unleashed. The power to restore balance, to destroy the Harbinger, to end the conflict and save everyone. But at what cost? The dreamscape around them began to unravel faster, fraying at the edges as time seemed to stretch and bend. They could hear the distant cries of the lucid whispers, their voices caught in the winds of the dying dreamscape. Reverie's heart pounded, a drumbeat in time with the pull of the abyss. You've already lost so much, the abyss whispered. You've lost your past, your innocence, your allies. Let me give it all back to you. All you have to do is embrace me. The temptation was overwhelming. Reverie's thoughts blurred, each moment stretching longer than the last, like a nightmare they couldn't wake from. They could feel the abyss licking at the edges of their consciousness, threatening to swallow them whole. But then, in the silence of their mind, they remembered the faces of their friends, Kaelin, Noxera, the lucid whispers who had trusted them, the ones who had fought beside them. They remembered their promise to Luni, to never let their darkness define them, to protect Dormiria no matter the cost. The abyss offered power, yes, but it also offered destruction. It would consume them. It would destroy everything they loved, everything they had fought to build. The abyss was a lie, one that promised peace and order at the cost of chaos and correction. Reverie's breath steadied as they clenched their fists, fighting the pull of the abyss. They could feel the whispers grow louder, the power pressing in on them like a vice, but they resisted. Slowly, they took a step back from the edge, forcing themselves to focus on the dreamscape, on the people they had sworn to protect. No, Reverie said softly, though their voice trembled. I won't let you win. The abyss screamed in frustration, a roar that rattled the very fabric of reality, but Reverie stood firm. The darkness was still there, swirling beneath their skin, but they could feel their own light beginning to push back against it. They weren't defined by their past, nor by the power the abyss offered. They were defined by the choices they made, the alliances they forged, and the dreams they fought to protect. Reverie took a deep breath, letting the steady rhythm of their heartbeat anchor them. They would not surrender. Not now. Not ever. I will save Dormiria, Reverie said, voice growing stronger. And I will do it on my own terms. With one final forceful push, Reverie began to weave the dreamscape back together, rejecting the abyss's hold and focusing instead on the strength of their own will. The darkness was still there, but it was now under their control, a tool rather than a master. The battle for Dormiria was far from over, but Reverie had made their choice. They would face the Harbinger, and they would do so with their humanity intact. They had learned that true strength came not from power, but from the will to protect, to rebuild, and to never give in. Chapter 11. A Dreamweaver's burden. The weight of Dormiria pressed heavily on Reverie's shoulders, a burden that had grown steadily heavier with each passing day. The once vibrant dreamscapes that had flourished under the guidance of the lucid whispers were now withering, slowly crumbling under the immense pressure of the Harbinger's influence. Each day, the dream realm grew more unstable, the seams between dreams and reality beginning to tear apart. Reverie had always been a dream weaver, a creator of worlds, but now they found themselves forced into the impossible role of both protector and destroyer. The dreamscape stretched before them, a fractured web of illusions and reality teetering on the edge of collapse. Reverie closed their eyes, summoning the delicate threads of power within them. The abyssal resonance that lingered beneath their skin pulsed with life, a dark reminder of the path they had walked and the temptation that still beckoned them. They had rejected its pull, but it had not let go. The darkness lingered, a constant undercurrent, threatening to rise at any moment. "We're losing them," Reverie murmured under their breath, their gaze sweeping over the council gathered before them. The lucid whispers, their once unified faction, were now fractured, divided by fear, doubt, and the creeping corruption of the dreamscapes. They could see it in their eyes, the uncertainty, the growing desperation. Dormiria was dying, and they didn't know how to stop it. Kalen, one of the few who had remained loyal, stood by Reverie's side, his expression hard and determined. "We've tried everything, Reverie," he said quietly. "The Harbinger is too powerful. We're out of options." Reverie's heart clenched at the thought. Every strategy, every attempt to stabilize the dream realm had failed. The Harbinger's influence spread like wildfire, bending the fabric of the dreamscapes to its will, twisting them into nightmarish versions of their former selves. And yet, Reverie could not bring themselves to give in. The temptation of the abyss still whispered in the back of their mind, urging them to use its power to save Dormiria at any cost. But at what cost? "Perhaps there's another way," Reverie said, the words coming out as a half-formed thought. They had been searching for a solution, any solution, to save the dreamscape without losing themselves in the process. But the more they searched, the more they realized that every choice came with a sacrifice, and in the end, it would always be the dreamscape that paid the price. "You know what that would mean," Kalen warned, his voice low. "If you take that path, there will be no going back." Reverie nodded, their mind racing. They had thought of the abyssal power, considered the possibility of using it to force the Harbinger back. It would be a temporary fix, perhaps, but it would come at a terrible cost. To use the abyss would be to tear apart the dreamscape even further, to sacrifice the very thing they were trying to protect. The dreamscapes would bend and twist, the fragile threads of reality unraveling under the weight of their power. Reverie would be the one to weave those threads, but at what cost? Their eyes flickered to the rest of the council, the ones who still believed in them, who trusted them to make the right choice. They could feel their gaze upon them, heavy with expectation, and it made Reverie's heart ache. "I don't know what to do," Reverie confessed, the words slipping out before they could stop them. "Everything I've done has led us here, and every choice I make only makes it worse." The weight of leadership was crushing, suffocating. They had fought to protect Dormiria, to guide it into a new age, but it felt as though the more they fought, the more they destroyed. The dreamscapes, once a symbol of hope and creation, were becoming twisted versions of themselves. And the longer they held on to their power, the more they felt the corruption spreading within them. Every decision felt like a step closer to losing themselves completely. "Reverie," Kalen said, his voice soft, "you don't have to carry this alone." Reverie turned to him, meeting his gaze, and for the first time in days, they allowed themselves to feel the smallest sliver of hope. They had not been alone in this fight. The lucid whispers were still with them. They still had allies, still had people who believed in them. And yet, they couldn't shake the feeling that their every action was pushing them closer to the point of no return. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Reverie admitted, their voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen what the abyss can do. I've seen what it turns me into. If I lose myself, what happens to Dormiria? What happens to all of you?" The silence hung between them like a thick fog. Reverie knew that their friends, their allies, had watched them struggle, had seen the darkness within them begin to surface once more. The abyss was always there, a constant presence in the back of their mind, tempting them with its promises of power and control. The lines between light and shadow, dream and reality, were beginning to blur, and Reverie could no longer distinguish where they ended and the abyss began. "You can't save Dormiria by losing yourself," Kalen said, his voice firm. "You have to find another way. You can't let the darkness define you." But Reverie wasn't sure if they could. The abyss had already shaped so much of who they were, already twisted their memories and their identity. How could they be sure of who they were anymore? How could they lead the lucid whispers when they didn't even know what was left of themselves? The council waited in silence, each of them looking to Reverie for guidance, but Reverie had none to give. Every path forward seemed to lead to destruction. They could sacrifice the dreamscape, tear it apart to stop the Harbinger, or they could sacrifice themselves, embrace the abyss, and risk everything they had fought for. Either way, someone would lose, and Reverie knew deep down that whatever decision they made, they would never be the same. Chapter 12, Shattered Alliances. Reverie stood at the edge of the central dream-weaving chamber, watching as the swirling threads of the dreamscapes around them seemed to waver in response to their fluctuating emotions. Dormiria's protective barriers were crumbling faster with each passing day, and the weight of leadership felt unbearable. The once vibrant network of lucid whispers, allies who had stood by Reverie through countless trials, was now fractured. The tension had been building for weeks. Every decision Reverie made seemed to bring them closer to the abyss, not just metaphorically, but literally. The abyssal resonance within them thrummed, a constant reminder of the power they had yet to fully embrace and the darkness they risked succumbing to. Reverie had hoped they could control it, wield it as a tool, but the truth was inescapable. Each choice they made, each moment they relied on the abyss's strength, drew them deeper into its pull. And now, the cracks were appearing in the very core of their alliances. "Reverie, we need to talk." Cyrena Moonglade's voice cut through the stillness of the chamber like a blade. Reverie turned, finding the powerful and idealistic whisper standing at the entrance. Cyrena's usual serene demeanor was gone, replaced by a fierce, almost desperate look. Reverie's heart sank. They had known this confrontation was coming, but the weight of it still hit them like a hammer. "What's wrong, Cyrena?" Reverie asked, trying to keep their voice calm, even though a storm of doubt churned inside them. They had trusted Cyrena, had believed her to be one of the few who truly understood the complexities of their position as a leader and as a dreamweaver caught between light and shadow. Cyrena's eyes flashed with anger. "What's wrong? You're losing yourself. Reverie." She took a step forward, her presence like a force in the room. "You've been using the abyss more and more, letting it shape your decisions, your actions. You're no longer the whisper we once followed." Reverie felt their pulse quicken. "Cyrena, you don't understand. The Harbinger is too powerful. I'm doing what I have to in order to protect Dormiria." "No." Cyrena shook her head sharply. "That's the problem. You're doing what you think you have to, but it's all based on fear. You're using the abyss because it's easier than facing the consequences of your choices. It's a shortcut, Reverie, and it's leading us all to ruin." The words stung, sharper than any blade. Reverie had always known that their connection to the abyss was dangerous, but the idea that they were using it out of fear as a way to avoid responsibility felt like a betrayal of everything they had worked for. Yet there was a part of them, buried deep inside, that wondered if Cyrena was right. Had they become too reliant on the power the abyss offered? Had they lost sight of the balance they had once sought? "You think the abyss is your answer, but you're forgetting who you are," Cyrena continued, her voice growing more urgent. "You're a lucid whisper, Reverie. You shape dreams, not destroy them. You create, not tear apart. If you keep going down this path, you won't just lose your humanity, you'll lose everything that makes you who you are. Reverie flinched, the weight of her words crashing into them like a tidal wave. The doubts that had been whispering at the edges of their mind now grew louder, almost deafening. Could they really go on clinging to their identity as a lucid whisper if they were relying more and more on the abyss? I'm not tearing apart Dormiria, Cyrena. I'm trying to save it, Reverie said, their voice trembling despite their efforts to remain strong. I know the abyss isn't a perfect solution, but it's the only one that's working. Cyrena's face twisted with frustration. That's just it, Reverie. It isn't working. It's only temporary. Every time you use the abyss, every time you give in to its whispers, it changes you a little more. You're losing yourself, and Dormiria will fall with you. The silence that followed was suffocating, the words hanging between them like an insurmountable wall. Reverie wanted to argue, to defend themselves, but part of them couldn't. Part of them knew that Cyrena's fears weren't entirely unfounded. I don't want to lose myself, Reverie whispered, the vulnerability in their voice startling even them. But I don't know what else to do. The dreamscapes are dying, and I can't fix them with just the old ways. I need the abyss, Cyrena. Then you're already lost, Cyrena said, her voice quiet but resolute. If you think that's the only way forward, then I don't know if I can follow you anymore. Reverie felt their heart break at her words. This wasn't just a philosophical difference. This was a fracture in everything they had worked so hard to build. Cyrena had always been the pillar of idealism, the one who believed in the purity of their mission. To hear her doubt them, no, to see her turn away from them, cut deeper than any wound they had ever known. For a moment, they stood in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. Reverie wanted to reach out, to beg Cyrena to understand, but the chasm between them had already widened. Cyrena's idealism, her belief in the sanctity of the Dreamweaver's purpose, could not reconcile with Reverie's growing reliance on the abyss. Do what you must, Cyrena said at last, her voice cold and distant, but I will be a part of it. With that, Cyrena turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Reverie standing alone amidst the crumbling dreamscape. The room seemed to grow darker, the edges of reality fraying as the weight of her words settled into Reverie's heart. They had lost Cyrena, perhaps for good, and as the weight of that loss pressed down on them, Reverie couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The dreamscape was fracturing, their alliances were crumbling, and they were teetering on the brink of becoming something they feared. And all the while, the abyss whispered. The choice had never been clearer, but Reverie wasn't sure they could make it alone. Chapter 13, A Glimmer of Hope. The weight of the dreamscape's collapse pressed down on Reverie, each passing day a battle between maintaining their fragile leadership and clinging to the ideals that had once guided them. The war against the Harbinger raged on, and with it, the abyss stirred within, a constant, gnawing presence. Cyrena's departure had left a void, both in Reverie's heart and in their strategy. The tension between the factions of the Lucid Whispers grew, their loyalty tested by the sacrifices Reverie had made, and those yet to come. For days, Reverie wandered the shattered dreamscapes, searching for answers. They could feel the dissonance in the fabric of the dream realm, distorted, broken fragments of reality and imagination bleeding into one another. The power of the Harbinger had seeped into the very heart of Dormiria, leaving the dream world weak and fractured. Reverie could hear the whispers of the abyss growing louder, promising strength, but also the loss of everything they had fought to protect. They had reached the end of the line. The abyssal power was tempting, but they had seen the cost too many times. Lives shattered, alliances fractured, and their own humanity slowly eroding. Yet, in the face of this overwhelming darkness, a single flickering thought emerged, a spark of hope. What if there was a way to heal the dreamscapes without destroying them? What if there was a way to use the principles of both creation and destruction not as opposing forces, but as balanced powers that could coexist? Reverie sat down in the midst of the ruins, the once vibrant dreamscape, now nothing more than a desolate void. They closed their eyes, reaching deep within themselves, calling upon the very essence of dream weaving that had once felt so natural, so full of potential. The balance between light and shadow, creation and destruction, the very foundations of dreams. There had to be a way to restore harmony without becoming consumed by either side. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Reverie began to meditate, blocking out the noise of the crumbling world around them. They focused on the ebb and flow of their own power, the abyssal resonance that coiled within their very being, and the pure, untainted energy of creation that had always been their guiding force. At first, they struggled to reconcile the two, but as the hours passed, something began to shift. It was subtle at first, a whisper of an idea, a vision of a new form of dreamweaving, a method that didn't seek to obliterate what was broken, but to carefully mend it, not with brute force, but with precision and patience. Reverie saw in their mind's eye a weaving of threads, some dark, some light, that would form a tapestry of balance rather than dominance. They could shape the dreams, not through destruction, but through transformation, guiding them back to their original state without allowing them to become what they had been before. Reverie's heart quickened as the understanding deepened, the weight of the revelation settling over them. This was the key, a delicate, careful manipulation of both creation and destruction, a process of healing that didn't erase the past, but worked with it, restoring the dreamscapes from within. The abyssal power could still be harnessed, but only in balance, only when tempered with the light of creation. With newfound clarity, Reverie rose from the ground, their hands glowing with an ethereal light. They called upon the energy within them, letting the threads of both darkness and light intertwine in a careful, deliberate weave. It was as if the very fabric of the dreamscape responded to their intentions, fragile but willing to shift, to bend. The first thread they wove was one of restoration, a dreamscape once shattered, now slowly beginning to take form again. Reverie reached into the broken pieces of the dream, drawing them together, not through force, but through the gentle application of their will. The result was not a mere patching up of the fragments, but a reconstitution, a reweaving of the dream that honored its original form while allowing it to grow anew. The dreamscape around them began to change, the shattered edges smoothing out as the energy flowed through them. Reverie could feel the tension in the air, an almost palpable force, as if the dreamscape itself was breathing, coming back to life. And yet, it was not an immediate fix. The process was slow, deliberate, and required constant care. Reverie smiled, feeling a glimmer of hope. This was it, the answer they had been searching for, a balance between creation and destruction, a method of healing that didn't rely on one or the other, but instead merged the two, allowing them to coexist in harmony. Reverie knew the road ahead would still be fraught with challenges, more battles, more difficult choices, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they saw a way forward. They couldn't save Dormiria with brute force, nor could they restore it by rejecting the abyss completely. The power within them, the power of both the lucid whisper and the abyss, could be the key to a new way of dream weaving, a way that healed without obliterating, a way that embraced both light and shadow, creation and destruction. Reverie's heart swelled with renewed purpose. They were not just the protector of the dreamscapes, nor the leader of the lucid whispers. They were a bridge between worlds, between light and dark, between the past and the future. And in this new role, they would bring Dormiria back from the brink. As they stood there, in the center of the dreamscape they had just healed, Reverie realized that the true power of a Dreamweaver wasn't in their ability to destroy or create, it was in their ability to weave both into something greater than either alone. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Reverie felt they were walking it with a sense of clarity and hope. They weren't just fighting to protect Dormiria anymore, they were fighting to rebuild it, to restore it to something better. And perhaps, just perhaps, they could do so without losing themselves along the way. Chapter 14, The Abyssal Trial. The dreamscape around Reverie was quiet, eerily so. The air was thick with a tension that pressed down upon them, heavy and suffocating. They had unlocked a new way of dream weaving, a method that could restore the fractured realms of Dormiria without forsaking their humanity. Yet, with every thread they wove, every reality they mended, they felt a deeper pull from the abyss, a dark, insistent tug on their soul. It was as if the very power they had sought to control was beginning to control them instead. The abyss had always been within them, a shadow that whispered at the edges of their thoughts. But now, with the awakening of their new powers, the darkness was not just a voice, it was a presence. It surrounded them, closing in like a storm, its tendrils creeping through the cracks in their resolve. Reverie could feel it. The abyss was testing them, pulling at the threads of their identity. With every act of creation they performed, the abyss reacted, growing stronger, feeding on the very essence of their work. The harmony they had achieved felt fragile, threatened by the deep, gnawing hunger of the darkness within them. They closed their eyes, breathing deeply, focusing on the center of their being. But it was no use. The moment they let their guard down, the abyss surged, filling their mind with a swirl of chaotic images. Dark, twisted versions of themselves, beings of shadow and destruction, rose from the depths of their past, surrounding them in a sea of doubt. You cannot control us, Reverie. A voice hissed from within the darkness, familiar and ancient. You are one of us. You always have been. The figure before them was a shadowy reflection of themselves, tall and menacing, with eyes that glowed with the purest blackness. The creature smiled, its lips curling with cruel amusement. You were created to wield the abyss, to shape it, to destroy with it. You were born of darkness. You will always return to it. Reverie's heart pounded, the weight of their past pressing down on them. These shadows, they were pieces of themselves, aspects of their true nature they had once tried to bury. The abyss wasn't just a power, it was their origin, the core of their being, and now it was threatening to reclaim them. But Reverie wasn't the same person they had once been. They had rejected the abyss once, choosing the path of the lucid whisper. Instead, they had made peace with their past, or so they thought. This was a trial, a test. The abyss wanted them to surrender, to embrace their darker nature once more. But Reverie refused to give in. I am not Huey, Reverie whispered, their voice steady despite the turmoil raging within them. I am more than the abyss. I am the bridge between light and dark. I am the choice to create, not destroy. The shadow before them laughed, a hollow, mocking sound. You cannot escape your nature, Reverie. The darkness is always there, inside you. It will consume you, just as it consumed all those before you. The abyssal figure lunged forward, its tendrils reaching out to seize them. Reverie instinctively reached for their powers, summoning a shield of light and shadow, but the abyss twisted the fabric of their creation, warping it into a form that sought to devour them whole. The battle raged on, a furious clash of light and darkness, creation and destruction. Reverie could feel the pressure mounting as the abyss pushed harder, threatening to overwhelm their will. They fought to maintain control, weaving the threads of light into the fabric of their defense, but the abyss twisted and corrupted their efforts, turning their own creations against them. It was in that moment of desperation that Reverie understood the truth. The abyss wasn't just a force to be resisted. It was part of them, a part that could never be erased or banished. To defeat it, to master it, they needed to accept it, not as an enemy, but as a part of their identity. They closed their eyes again, reaching deep within themselves, accepting the darkness instead of pushing it away. The abyss was not the enemy. It was a force to be understood, to be controlled. Reverie extended their consciousness into the depths, embracing the power it offered, but not letting it consume them. For a moment, the world went still. The shadows of the abyss receded, and Reverie was left standing alone in a vast, empty space. The pressure, the weight was gone. They could feel the abyss within them, but it no longer controlled them. It was a part of their being, but no longer their master. The shadowy reflection of themselves stood before them once again, but this time it was different. It was no longer an enemy. It was an aspect of themselves, a part of their past they had once feared but now accepted. "You are more than us," the shadow said, its voice quieter, less threatening. "You have chosen your path. You are the lucid whisper, the one who bridges light and dark. You have mastered us, Reverie." Reverie nodded slowly, their hearts still heavy, but now filled with a quiet strength. "I am not defined by my past. I am defined by my choices." The abyss had tested them, tempted them, but Reverie had learned to master it, not by rejecting it, but by embracing it as part of their identity. The darkness was not an enemy to be destroyed. It was a force to be understood, a part of their power that could be wielded with wisdom and control. As the abyssal reflection faded into the ether, Reverie stood alone in the stillness. They had passed the trial, not by defeating the darkness, but by learning to coexist with it. With newfound resolve, Reverie turned their attention back to the dreamscape. The battle against the Harbinger was far from over, and the war for Dormiria would only grow more difficult. But Reverie had gained something invaluable in the abyssal trial: control over the darkness within them, a deeper understanding of their true nature, and the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The true test had not been the Harbinger, nor the fractured dreamscapes. It had been mastering themselves. And with that, Reverie knew they were finally ready for the next step in their journey. Chapter 15: The Harbinger's Influence. The wind howled through the dreamscapes of Dormiria, the once peaceful realm, now a battlefield in the war against the Harbinger. Reverie stood at the heart of it, their senses heightened, feeling the tremors of reality itself, as though the very foundations of the dream realm were cracking beneath them. The tension in the air was thick with fear that something darker, something insidious, was beginning to take root. The Harbinger had never been one to relent. Reverie had expected the attacks to grow more fierce, but what they had not anticipated was the Harbinger's ability to twist the dreamscapes into instruments of pure terror. Each assault was more than just an attempt to destabilize the realm. It was an attack on Reverie's very soul. From the shadows, the Harbinger's influence crept through the cracks in the veil, reaching into the deepest recesses of the dream realm, warping the dreamscapes into grotesque distortions. What had once been peaceful, serene landscapes now became nightmarish horrors, visions of fire and ice, of endless voids and monstrous beings that seemed to tear at the fabric of existence itself. The lucid whispers, already weary from the constant struggle, found themselves caught in the grip of these warped realities. Every dream they entered became a battlefield, each one laced with terror that tested their courage and their will. Reverie felt it too, the pressure, the weight of fear, the growing unease that was choking the very heart of Dormiria. And in the midst of this chaos, the Harbinger's voice rang out, cutting through the nightmares like a blade. It was distant at first, a whisper from the dark edges of the dreamscape, but it grew louder with every passing day, more insistent. "You cannot escape the truth, Reverie," the voice purred, a distorted echo of their own. "You are nothing more than a tool, a weapon of destruction, created for a purpose, forged in the abyss, and sent here to undo all that you seek to protect. The dreams were never meant to be your domain, nor was Dormiria. You were made for destruction, nothing more. Reverie's heart skipped a beat. The words cut deep, more than they were willing to admit. They had already faced their own dark past, the abyss that had shaped them, but hearing it from the Harbinger, hearing it confirmed in such a brutal, callous way, was like a wound reopened. It was a reminder that their existence, their very being, had always been a weapon forged in the shadow of the abyss. The abyss had always whispered to them, but now the Harbinger was showing them the truth. There was no escape from what they were. The power of the abyss had not only been a part of them, it had been their purpose. As Reverie wandered the Dreamscapes, seeking some semblance of peace, they encountered the nightmarish manifestations of the Harbinger's attacks. Dreams once filled with hope and creation now writhed in terror, spiraling into endless chaos. Each landscape they touched fell into ruin, cities crumbling, landscapes splintering, skies darkening into nothingness. But among the shattered dreamscapes, there were whispers fragile and faint, echoes of those who still fought, still held on to the belief that Dormiria could survive. Reverie pressed forward, determined to protect the few sparks of hope that remained. Yet, with every attempt to heal, the Harbinger's attacks grew stronger. Reverie's efforts to restore the dreams were met with forceful resistance, as if the very fabric of the dream realm had begun to fight back against their intervention. It was as if the Harbinger knew every move they would make, every thread they sought to weave, and twisted it with a terrifying precision. The nightmares took new, more personal forms. Reverie began to experience visions not just of destruction, but of their own weaknesses, of moments when they had faltered, when they had made mistakes, when they had doubted themselves. Faces of lost allies, fallen whispers, haunted them, their silent eyes accusing Reverie of failure. In one dreamscape, Reverie found themselves standing at the edge of a vast chasm, a black void stretching endlessly before them. The whispers of their past echoed in the air, voices distorted by sorrow and regret. "You abandoned us," one voice accused. "You were never strong enough," another whispered. The abyss, that ever-present force within them, stirred, urging Reverie to listen, to give in, to let the darkness take over and silence the guilt. It would be so easy, so tempting. They had the power to end it all, to destroy the nightmares, to eradicate the Harbinger, to restore Dormiria with a single, devastating blow. But Reverie knew the cost. They had come too far to let themselves fall back into the darkness. They had chosen to embrace balance, to walk the fine line between light and dark. Losing the abyss's power to crush their enemies would only drag them back into the very thing they had fought so hard to escape. The temptation to yield to the abyss, to become the weapon the Harbinger claimed they were meant to be, was overwhelming. But Reverie fought against it, pressing forward, refusing to let the nightmares consume them. Suddenly, a voice cut through the chaos, sharp and defiant. "You are not what they say you are. You are more than the abyss. You are not a weapon. You are a protector." It was Cyrena Moonglade, a voice that had once been a source of conflict, now a beacon of light in the darkness. She stood in the distance, her own form glowing with a faint but steady light, defying the nightmare around them. Reverie took a breath, steadying themselves. The Harbinger's words echoed again, louder now, like a storm building to a crescendo. "You can't stop what we were meant to be," the Harbinger's voice taunted, its shape flickering behind them. "Embrace it. You belong to me." But Reverie, with Cyrena's words echoing in their mind, found their strength once again. They were not just a product of the abyss. They had the power to change, to reshape their destiny. The Harbinger could not define them. Only Reverie could. With a steadying breath, Reverie raised their hands, weaving a barrier of light and shadow around them, pushing back against the Harbinger's influence. The nightmarish visions shattered, fading like fragments of smoke. They could feel the abyss inside them, but now it was under their control, not the other way around. "You cannot break me," Reverie declared, their voice steady and filled with resolve. "I choose my path. I choose who I am." The Harbinger's presence faltered, the grip on the dreamscape loosening. The nightmarish visions began to recede, replaced by a sliver of hope, a fragile but real glimmer of light in the darkness. The battle was far from over, but Reverie knew that the war against the Harbinger would not be won by force alone. It would be won by the strength to face their past, to embrace their true power, and to protect the dreamers and the dreamscapes with the wisdom and clarity they had fought so hard to attain. The Harbinger's influence had not broken them. It had only strengthened their resolve. Chapter 16, The Choice of Sacrifice. The city of Corrine was a bustling hub in Dormiria, a place where dreams flowed like rivers and where the aspirations of thousands of dreamers found a place to take shape. It was a city of artistry and invention, where people molded their hopes and desires into creations of unimaginable beauty. The dreamscapes that surrounded it were vibrant and alive, reflecting the collective spirit of the dreamers who lived there. But now, the once beautiful city was crumbling. The ground trembled beneath Reverie's feet as they stood at the heart of the devastation. The city, once so full of life, was now nothing more than a twisted ruin. The Harbinger's influence had torn through the dreamscape with terrifying force, unraveling the delicate fabric of Corrine's dreams as if it were paper caught in a storm. Buildings once full of light and possibility were now fractured and decaying, sinking into the endless black void beneath. Reverie's heart raced, a familiar sense of helplessness rising in their chest. They had faced destruction before, but never like this. The Harbinger's assault had not just warped the dreamscape, it had shattered the essence of the city itself. The dreams of the people, their hopes, their identities, were being consumed, pulled into the abyss. What remained was a cold, soulless landscape, a reflection of despair. Standing at the edge of the ruined city, Reverie could feel it in their very being, the pull of the abyss calling to them, promising a solution. It whispered to them, offering them the power to reshape the dreamscape, to restore Corrine to its former glory. But that power came at a cost. Reverie's connection to the abyss had always been a double-edged sword. The abyss was a force of creation and destruction, a power that could reshape reality itself, but also consume everything in its path, including the soul of whoever wielded it. Reverie knew that to restore Corrine to its former state would require losing the abyss's energy, a force that, once tapped, would slowly erode their very essence. With each use, they would lose more of themselves, more of the person they had fought so hard to become. The temptation was overwhelming. The city of Corrine, its dreamers, and its hopes hung in the balance. They had seen the destruction firsthand, had watched the streets collapse under the weight of the Harbinger's assault. The people of Corrine had done nothing wrong. They were innocents caught in the crossfire of a war that threatened to consume all of Dormiria. Could they really stand by and let it all be lost? A quiet voice broke through the storm of their thoughts. It was Cyrena standing beside them, her eyes filled with concern. "Reverie, don't do it. You've seen what the abyss can do. It will take more than just your power. It will take your very soul." Reverie didn't answer at first. Their gaze locked on the devastation before them. The whispers of the abyss grew louder, more insistent. They could feel its tendrils creeping into their thoughts, wrapping around their heart. The power to save Corrine, to restore the dreams of its people, was within their grasp. But at what cost? "You know what this will do to you?" Cyrena continued, her voice trembling slightly. "You've already sacrificed so much. You can't keep giving pieces of yourself away. The words echoed in Reverie's mind. How many more pieces of themselves could they afford to lose? How many more times could they sacrifice their own humanity for the sake of others? The question burned in their chest like a brand, and yet the people of Corrine were still there. Reverie could feel their dreams, their aspirations, floating around them like fragile butterflies, struggling to survive in the suffocating darkness. Could they let those dreams die? Could they turn away from the people who had placed their faith in them, the people who needed them now more than ever? The abyss whispered again, this time directly into Reverie's ear, its voice honeyed with false comfort. You can save them, Reverie. Just reach out to me. All you need is to let go. All you need is to surrender. The temptation was maddening. Reverie could already feel the power building inside them, the surge of energy that could rewrite the very fabric of the dreamscape. The city of Corrine could be restored, its people, their hopes, their dreams saved. But the cost would be too high. Reverie would lose more of themselves, more of the person they had fought so hard to become. They would become a shadow of their former self, a hollow vessel of power, consumed by the very force they had fought to resist. But the abyss's pull was like a gravity well, sucking everything into its depths. Reverie could feel it threatening to swallow them whole. In that moment, a thought crystallized in Reverie's mind, a realization that had been growing stronger with every passing day. Saving Corrine, saving the dreamers didn't have to come at the cost of their soul. They didn't have to sacrifice who they were to restore what had been lost. Enough, Reverie whispered to themselves, shaking their head as they took a step back. The abyss recoiled, its tendrils snapping back into the shadows, its whispers turning to snarls of anger and frustration. Reverie turned away from the temptation, their heart heavy with the weight of their decision. Cyrena's gaze softened as she saw Reverie's resolve firming. You can still save them, Reverie. There's another way. Reverie nodded slowly, realizing that there was still hope. The answer didn't lie in wielding the abyss's destructive power. It lay in the strength of the dreamers themselves, their collective will to live, to rebuild, to heal. If they could come together, if they could unite their dreams and their hopes, then Corrine could rise again. Not by the hands of one individual, but by the collective strength of many. With a deep breath, Reverie closed their eyes, centering themselves. They reached out not to the abyss, but to the very core of the dreamers' hearts. They could feel their hopes, their fears, their desires, all intertwined in a delicate web. Reverie began to weave, not with the raw power of the abyss, but with the light and love that had always existed in Dormiria. Slowly, Corrine began to change. The ruins began to heal, the fractured dreamscapes knitting themselves back together. The buildings, once crumbled, began to rise from the ashes, their forms soft and fluid, a reflection of the strength of the dreamers who had fought to protect them. The people of Corrine began to reappear, their faces filled with awe and relief as their city was restored. It was not an instant fix. The process was slow, painstaking, but the dreamers of Corrine were resilient. They had always been. And now, with Reverie guiding them, they would rebuild not just the city, but their dreams together. Reverie stood, watching as the city slowly began to come back to life. The abyss still lurked within them, a reminder of their past, but it no longer held them captive. They had chosen the light over the darkness, the unity of the dreamers over the solitary power of the abyss. and in doing so, they had found a new strength, one that would carry them forward, not just as a protector of Dormiria, but as a true Dreamweaver. The sacrifice had been great, but the cost of saving Dormiria was one they were willing to bear. Chapter 17, The Breaking Point. The world around Reverie was unraveling. The dreamscape trembled beneath them, shaking with a force far greater than anything they had encountered before. Corinne, once a beacon of hope and resilience, now stood on the precipice of total collapse. The darkness that the Harbinger had sown was spreading faster than Reverie could repair, and the abyss within them thrummed with an insistent hunger, whispering promises of power and destruction. They could feel its pull clawing at the edges of their mind, urging them to let go, to embrace it fully and end the suffering in one swift, decisive strike. But Reverie had fought too hard for control to give in now. Sweat beaded on their forehead, their hands trembling as they reached out, trying to stabilize the disintegrating dreamscape. They had to hold it together, if only for a little longer. The sky above Corinne was a swirling maelstrom of light and shadow, as if the very fabric of the dreamscape itself was being torn apart. The city's once peaceful streets now flickered between reality and nightmare, the structures collapsing into nothingness, only to rise again as twisted, corrupted versions of themselves. Figures, distorted and ghastly, moved through the chaos, remnants of dreams long lost to the abyss. Each pulse of the abyss within Reverie felt like a stab to the chest, a dark pressure suffocating them from the inside. The power was there, just out of reach, promising to solve everything in an instant, to return Corinne to its former state. But it came at a cost Reverie was not sure they could afford anymore. Stay focused. The voice of Cyrena broke through the haze, her figure appearing beside them, a steadying presence in the midst of the storm. You can do this, but you have to hold on. Don't let it take you. Reverie barely registered her words, their attention consumed by the instability of the dreamscape. A rift opened before them, a jagged tear in the sky that threatened to swallow everything. Reverie reached out, desperate to close it, but the abyss within them surged forward, a burning wave of power that threatened to break their will. They could feel it. It was close, so close to breaking free. I have to fix this, Reverie muttered to themselves, pushing through the growing tide of darkness. Their connection to the abyss had always been a fragile thing, a constant balancing act between creation and destruction. Now, however, it felt as though the scales were tipping, the darkness threatening to consume them completely. Every time they used their powers to mend the dreamscape, the abyss surged stronger, as if feeding off their very essence. They could feel it draining them. The edges of their vision blurred, and for a moment they saw only blackness before them. The weight of the power within them, the weight of the choices they had made, was unbearable. Stay with me, Reverie. Cyrena's voice came again, sharper this time. You're stronger than this. You've always been. Reverie's hands clenched into fists, nails digging into their palms as they fought to maintain control. They had done this before. They had faced the abyss head-on and survived. They had resisted its call time and time again. But this was different. The power inside them had grown stronger, more insistent, and now it was beginning to take its toll. Their breath quickened, their chest rising and falling as if each inhalation was a battle. Reverie's body trembled, the strain of holding the dreamscape together starting to take its toll. They could feel their heart racing in time with the abyss's pulse, a dark rhythm that echoed deep within their soul. Every part of them screamed to release it, to let the abyss consume the dreamscape and bring an end to the suffering, but Reverie's resolve held firm. "I won't give in," they whispered, though the words felt hollow. Yet, as the words left their mouth, the cracks in the dreamscape grew wider, and Reverie could feel themselves beginning to fracture as well. The strain of holding it all together was unbearable. They were fighting two battles now, one against the Harbinger's influence, and one against the abyss itself, and both were threatening to tear them apart. A surge of darkness ripped through them, and for a fleeting moment, Reverie was consumed by it. The abyss, ever hungry, filled the void inside them, taking everything in its wake. They saw flashes of their past, visions of destruction, of things they had done in the name of power, in the name of survival. Their former self, the one who had embraced the abyss without question, beckoned them forward, whispering promises of freedom from the struggle, of the power to reshape the dreamscape in their image. But then, something else pierced through the blackness. It was a memory, faint but undeniable, a moment of clarity. Cyrena, her face, full of concern and love, seemed to cut through the fog. "You don't have to do this alone, Reverie." The words, simple as they were, grounded Reverie. They were not alone. They had never been alone, and though the abyss had always been a part of them, it did not define them. The dreams they had created, the lives they had touched, they were more than just the shadow of the abyss. They were Reverie, the one who had chosen to protect, to heal, and to grow. In that moment, Reverie took a deep breath, their body trembling as they reached for the light within themselves. With all their strength, they pulled the darkness back, pushing against the abyss's grasp, forcing it into submission. The power was still there, still waiting, but Reverie no longer let it control them. With Cyrena's presence beside them and their own inner strength fueling them, Reverie released a wave of energy, not from the abyss, but from the core of their being. The dreamscape responded, shifting and stabilizing under their influence. The rift in the sky closed slowly, and the shattered structures of Corrine began to mend. It was not an instantaneous fix, but it was a beginning. Reverie collapsed to their knees, breathless and exhausted. The toll was immense. The weight of their powers, the strain of maintaining control, had drained them in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. But they had done it. They had resisted the abyss, had held the dreamscape together just long enough to save what remained of Corrine. Cyrena knelt beside them, her hand on their shoulder. "You did it," she said softly. "You're still here, and you're still you." Reverie closed their eyes, leaning into the comfort of her touch. The battle was far from over, and the abyss still lingered within them, waiting for the next chance to break free. But for now, they had won. They had held the line, and that was enough. For now. Chapter 18, Confronting the Harbinger. Reverie stood on the precipice of a dreamscape that was neither real nor entirely unreal. The sky above was a swirling mix of shadows and fractured light, as if the very fabric of the realm had been torn apart and hastily stitched back together. Beneath their feet, the ground pulsed with a heartbeat that was both familiar and alien, like the rhythmic thrum of a forgotten past. It was a dreamscape built from their own memories and fears, an echo of everything they had experienced, everything they had tried to leave behind. And standing before them, cloaked in darkness, was the Harbinger. The figure loomed like a towering shadow, its form shifting between the remnants of lost dreamscapes and twisted, half-remembered horrors. Its presence filled the air, suffocating, overwhelming, a constant reminder of the power it wielded. The Harbinger's face, if one could call it a face, was an ever-changing blur, shifting between sharp angles, vacant eyes, and haunting smiles, like a mask that refused to settle on any one expression. And its voice, when it came, was like the sound of 1,000 whispers, soft, sinister, and filled with knowing malice. "So, you've come," the Harbinger said, its voice dripping with mockery. "How noble! How tragic!" Reverie's fists clenched at their sides, the familiar weight of the abyssal resonance stirring within them, coaxing them into submission. They could feel the power, thick and heavy, pulling at the edges of their consciousness. It wanted to flood their veins, to take control. It was so close, just a breath away. But Reverie had fought too hard to let it claim them now. "This is your doing," Reverie said, their voice steady despite the storm raging within. "You're the one who brought this darkness, the one who corrected the dreamscape. You're the one who's been calling to me." The Harbinger's form twisted with laughter, the sound disjointed and haunting. "I didn't call you, child. No, you called to me. You were always meant to be mine. The abyss did not choose you. You chose it. It was inevitable, a part of you as much as your blood runs through your veins." A wave of cold mist washed over Reverie, the words striking deep, reaching into the very heart of their being. The abyss had always been a part of them. From the moment they were born from its depths, they had carried its weight, its hunger, its need for destruction. They had resisted it, rejected it, tried to shape their own path. But the Harbinger's words gnawed at them, bringing the doubts that lay dormant to the surface. "You can feel it, can't you?" the Harbinger continued, its voice smooth like honey, but sharp like a blade. "The abyss is calling you back. It always has and always will. It is your nature to destroy, to unravel. Don't deny it. You were born to be a weapon, to serve the darkness, to break everything in your path." Reverie staggered backward, their breath coming in short gasps. They could hear the whisper of the abyss within them, the seductive promises of power, of freedom. It would be so easy to give in, to take what was offered, and embrace the power that had always been within their grasp. The vision of Corinne, broken, fractured, filled with suffering, flashed before their eyes. The temptation to end it all, to fix the dreamscape with nothing more than a thought, was overwhelming. But Reverie had fought for too long to let the darkness consume them. "I'm not your weapon," they said, their voice trembling with a resolve that surprised even themselves. "I'm not a tool for destruction." The Harbinger's face twisted into a cruel smile. "You are destruction, Reverie. You always have been, and you will be again. The abyss will take you just as it took your past, just as it will take Dormiria when it's time." For a moment, Reverie felt the weight of those words settle over them. The idea that the abyss was their true calling, something they could never escape, was a bitter truth. It was a part of them, as much as their heart beat within their chest. But that didn't mean they had to succumb to it. They couldn't let the abyss define them. They couldn't let it win. The Harbinger's form flickered, its shadow stretching across the dreamscape like an encroaching tide. "You will fall. All will fall. Dormiria will fall." "Not today," Reverie replied, their voice low but filled with a burning determination. In that moment, something inside Reverie shifted. The abyss within them pulsed, louder now, stronger, its whispers growing frantic, urging them to break free of their chains. But Reverie took a deep breath, grounding themselves in the core of who they had become. They were not the sum of their darkness. They were not the creature the abyss had crafted. They were Reverie, a dreamweaver, a protector, someone who had chosen to stand against the shadows. They closed their eyes, centering themselves. When they opened them again, the Harbinger was no longer just a shadow. It was a mirror, a distorted, grotesque version of Reverie's own reflection, twisted by fear and darkness. The vision was horrifying, yet familiar. The Harbinger was not a separate entity, but a part of them, a manifestation of all they had once been, all they had feared they might become again. "This is who you are," the Harbinger whispered, its voice thick with triumph. "You are nothing but a broken dream. You always have been, and you always will be." But Reverie did not flinch. They had already faced the abyss inside them and had chosen to fight. Now they faced it again, this time not as a part of them, but as something they could defeat. "You don't control me," Reverie said, louder now, their voice gaining strength. "You never have. I choose who I am. I choose who I will become." With a snap of their fingers, the dreamscape around them warped, bending and shifting under their control. The Harbinger's form flickered and wavered, the darkness recoiling as Reverie wove the dreamscape into something new. They forged a barrier of light and shadow, a delicate balance between the two realms. The Harbinger screamed in fury as it was pushed back, but it could not touch Reverie. Not anymore. Reverie stood tall, their heart racing but their mind clear. "This is my fight, and I will win." The dreamscape shifted again, this time with a force that shattered the Harbinger's form into fragments. The echoes of the abyss that had once consumed Reverie receded, retreating into the depths, unable to touch them anymore. For now they had won, but Reverie knew this battle was far from over. The Harbinger would return, and the war for Dormiria's soul was only just beginning. But Reverie was no longer afraid. They had chosen their path, and they would see it through, no matter what darkness lay ahead. Chapter 19, the final battle. The air was thick with tension as Dormiria's forces assembled, their ranks fortified by the unity that Reverie had painstakingly nurtured. The once fractured lucid whispers stood together now, their hearts and minds aligned with a single purpose. Above them, the sky was torn, dark clouds swirling in a maelstrom of chaos, the very heavens bleeding with the energy of the conflict to come. The final battle loomed on the horizon, and it was as if the realm itself could feel the impending clash, the very earth trembling beneath their feet. Reverie stood at the forefront of the gathering, their figure a quiet anchor amidst the rising storm. The abyssal resonance pulsed within them, an unrelenting presence, a reminder of the darkness they had come so close to succumbing to. The power was intoxicating, like a drug, a fire that could burn brighter than the sun, but also one that could consume them completely. They could feel it coiling in their veins, urging them to unleash its full potential, to end the war in an instant. But they resisted as they had before. The fight wasn't about winning at any cost. It was about preserving the dreamscape. It was about preserving Dormiria and themselves. The dreamscape was shifting around them, twisting and bending, reacting to the tension in the air. Reverie could see the forces of the Harbinger taking shape in the distance. Nightmare creatures and corrupted dreamweavers, shadows born from the very fear and chaos the Harbinger had sowed. The air was thick with the scent of corruption, the weight of destruction pressing down on them like a looming shadow. Reverie, Sirena Moonglade's voice cut through the haze, steady and firm. The former challenger now stood beside them, her gaze unwavering. "The forces are ready. We've prepared as much as we can." Reverie nodded, their mind focused, but heavy. Then it's time. We'll stand together. The battlefield stretched before them, the jagged remnants of broken dreamscapes and twisted ruins forming a desolate backdrop. The armies of Dormiria, though diminished and scarred, stood resolute. The lucid whispers, though still divided in their hearts, were united by their faith in Reverie's leadership. The choice to fight, to protect, was one that had been made not out of blind loyalty but from a deep understanding of the stakes at hand. Reverie turned to face their army, their voice clear and commanding. This battle will define who we are. The Harbinger seeks to destroy all that we've built, but we will not let them. We are not defined by our darkness or by our past. We are defined by our will to protect what matters. We fight for Dormiria. We fight for all of us. A cheer erupted from the army, a roar of defiance that echoed across the shattered dreamscape. But even as Reverie felt a surge of hope, the weight of the abyss within them pressed harder, whispering promises of power, of dominance, of an end to this conflict with one decisive stroke. They clenched their fists, willing themselves to stay grounded. We will not fall, Reverie muttered, as much to themselves as to their forces. Not today, not ever. The clash began with an explosion of light and shadow. Reverie fought at the front, weaving the dreamscape with fluid, powerful strokes. They pulled the light from the depths of Dormiria, bending it to their will, using it to defend and protect. But the Harbinger's forces were relentless. Each nightmare creature that charged at them was a twisted reflection of fear and darkness, but they were also a part of Reverie's own creation. The line between the two blurred with every strike. Reverie's power surged, light and shadow dancing across the battlefield. They could feel the abyssal force within them, whispering to them, tempting them to unleash its full wrath. Their heart pounded in their chest, but they resisted. They would not let the darkness take control. But the pressure of the fight was starting to mount. The battle was fierce, and the enemy forces seemed endless. Reverie's body ached from the strain of channeling their powers, the toll of the war eating away at them, both physically and mentally. With each passing moment, it became harder to maintain the delicate balance between their light and their shadow. Reverie. Cyrena's voice rang out through the chaos. The powerful whisper fought beside them, her sword flashing as she cut down an enemy, but she was panting, her own struggle clear. You need to hold it together. We can't do this alone. Reverie nodded, but the abyss within them roared louder, the pull of its power almost too much to resist. The darkness, the very thing they had fought to keep at bay, was now tempting them with promises of strength, of an end to the pain. Just one push, Reverie, it whispered. One more push, and it will all be over. Dormiria will be saved. You will be the hero. You will be invincible. But Reverie fought back the urge. They had learned the hard way that the abyss could not be trusted. If they succumbed to it, there would be no saving anyone, not Dormiria, not themselves. The Harbinger's voice echoed across the battlefield, a taunting whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. You cannot win, Reverie. You are too weak. You were always meant to fall. Reverie's heart clenched, but they did not falter. I will not fall, they whispered to themselves. I choose to stand. Then, with a roar of defiance, Reverie launched themselves into the fray. They reached deep within themselves, pulling at both the light and the shadow, drawing on every ounce of strength they had left. The dreamscape around them bent and swirled, the very reality warping as Reverie wove it into a weapon of protection. In the midst of the chaos, Reverie found their true strength, not in the abyss, but in the connections they had made, in the bonds of trust and friendship that had been forged through this long and painful journey. It was not the darkness that defined them, but the love and protection they had for the people of Dormiria. With a final, powerful strike, Reverie broke through the Harbinger's defenses, using the full force of both their light and shadow to sever the bond that connected the Harbinger to the dreamscape. The Harbinger screamed, their form flickering and dissolving as the last of their nightmare creatures vanished into the void. The battlefield fell silent. Reverie stood in the center of the ruins, their body trembling, their energy spent. The dreamscape was shattered, the once bleeding sky now clearing, though the scars of battle would remain for a long time. But Dormiria had been saved. The forces of the Harbinger had been defeated, their influence broken. The realm was still standing, still alive, still dreaming. Reverie had faced their greatest test, not just in the external battle, but in the internal struggle between their light and shadow. And though the scars of the fight would remain, Reverie knew they had chosen the right path. They had chosen themselves. As Reverie looked out over the battlefield, the first light of dawn broke through the horizon, casting its warm glow across the land. The dreamscape would heal, as it always did, and though Reverie had been scarred, they knew that their fight had been worth it. They had protected Dormiria, not through brute force or dominance, but through the strength of their will, their compassion, and their unwavering belief in the future. The future of Dormiria, the future of the dreamers, and the future of Reverie. And with that, they took the first step into the next chapter of their journey, no longer just a product of the abyss, but a guardian of dreams. Chapter 28, Leader's Burden. The dust of battle hung thick in the air, swirling in the early light of dawn as Reverie surveyed the battlefield. The once barren dreamscape, scarred by the horrors of war, now bore the scars of victory. The shattered remnants of the Harbinger's army lay strewn across the land, their forms disintegrating into the void as the last of their influence was washed away. But for Reverie, there was no sense of triumph in this moment, only a heavy, oppressive silence, the weight of everything that had transpired settling deep within them. The lucid whispers, exhausted but resolute, began to gather around their leader. Some were wounded, their bodies scarred by battle. Others, like Cyrena, had eyes filled with weariness and loss, the toll of the fight etched into their expressions. They were victorious, but it was a hollow victory, a Pyrrhic triumph that came at a cost. Reverie's heart felt heavy as they watched the soldiers, their allies, and friends begin the long process of cleaning up the wreckage, of rebuilding what had been broken. Their mind replayed the faces of those lost in battle, the ones they couldn't save, the ones who had fought beside them, but now lay in the dust of this broken dreamscape. The guilt gnawed at them, even as the relief of victory began to settle in. Reverie. Cyrena's voice broke through their thoughts, soft and cautious. She stood beside them now, her eyes searching their face, but her tone was gentle, as if afraid to disturb the fragile quiet that had descended. The battle is over. You've done more than anyone could have expected. Dormiria stands because of you. Reverie turned toward her, their gaze distant, a hollow ache deep in their chest. I failed. Too many were lost. And for what? So we can rebuild, only to face another storm down the line? Cyrena shook her head, placing a hand on Reverie's shoulder. You couldn't have known. You couldn't have stopped it all. But what you did, what you've done, it was enough to save us. You've given Dormiria a chance. Not many leaders can say that. Reverie stared out at the horizon, where the first light of day touched the edges of the dreamscape, casting long shadows across the land. The wounds of the battle, both physical and emotional, were still raw, but it was the emotional toll that weighed on them the most. And what about the cost? How do we move forward knowing what we've lost? Cyrena was quiet for a long moment, her hand still on Reverie's shoulder. We carry the weight of what we've lost, but we also carry the hope of what we can rebuild. You taught us that, how to balance the darkness with the light, how to protect what we can, even in the face of unimaginable odds. Reverie closed their eyes, taking a slow, steadying breath. They could feel the abyssal power within them, still lingering, still whispering, urging them to fall back on it, to take the easy path of dominance and control. It would be so simple to allow the darkness to take over, to ensure that nothing could ever threaten Dormiria again. That they knew better now. The abyss had promised them strength, but at the cost of their soul. They could not afford to make that choice again. As the first of the lucid whispers began to gather the fallen and tend to the wounded, Reverie felt the weight of leadership settle heavily on their shoulders. They had fought the Harbinger, and they had won, but the fight was far from over. The realm, though safe for now, was still fractured. The dreamscape was still bleeding in places, the scars of the war marking its surface. And as much as Reverie longed for peace, they knew that this was only the beginning. Later that day, as the sun sank low in the sky, Reverie stood alone in the quiet of the council hall, surrounded by the familiar faces of the lucid whispers. They had called a meeting to discuss the future, how they would rebuild Dormiria, how they would ensure that something like the Harbinger's rise would never happen again. But the weight of the decisions before them, of the countless lives that depended on their leadership, felt crushing. Cyrena stood beside them, her presence a steadying force. It's a hard thing, isn't it? She asked quietly. To lead, to make decisions that affect everyone. We can undo the past, Reverie, but we can shape the future. Reverie nodded, but their gaze remained distant. I never wanted this. I never wanted to be a leader. They shook their head, frustration creeping into their voice. I've fought so hard to keep my balance, to not let the abyss consume me. And now I have to carry the weight of an entire realm. What if I fail? Cyrena's voice softened. You won't fail. We won't let you. You've already proven that you can carry this burden. You've shown us what it means to fight for what matters, even when it feels impossible. You're not alone, Reverie. We're in this together. The warmth of her words washed over them, but the fear still lingered. The fear that they were too broken, too scarred to truly be the leader Dormiria needed. That no matter how hard they tried, they might not be able to protect what they loved. But as Reverie looked out over the assembled whispers, they realized something. They had not led alone. They had fought together. And that was the key. Leadership was not about power, not about control. It was about unity. It was about trust. It was about the people you fought for. Thank you, Reverie whispered, their voice steady now, for standing with me. Cyrena smiled, her eyes filled with pride. Always. As the council meeting began and discussions on the future unfolded, Reverie stood at the center of it all. They had been thrust into the role of leader, a role they had never sought. But now, with the weight of the realm's future pressing down on them, they knew one thing for certain. They would not face it alone. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more wounds to heal, more hard choices to make. But for the first time in a long while, Reverie felt something other than the crushing weight of responsibility. They felt a glimmer of hope, flickering but bright, shining through the cracks of the burden they bore. And in that moment, they realized that leadership, like dreamweaving, was not about perfection. It was about balance. It was about holding on to the light, even in the darkest of times. It was about knowing that, no matter how many cracks formed in the veil, it was still worth fighting to protect. The burden of leadership might be heavy, but Reverie was ready to carry it. Chapter 21, The Fractured Dreamer. The city of Dormiria stretched out before Reverie, a shimmering reflection of dreams, both realized and unrealized. The land was scarred from the battle, the echoes of destruction still lingering in the air. Yet, amidst the ruins, new growth began to take shape, an indication that Dormiria was far from finished. Its spirit remained unbroken, much like the one who had fought to protect it. Reverie stood at the heart of the city, their presence both grounding and unsettling. The weight of their decisions pressed upon them, but instead of overwhelming them, it had become a compass, guiding them through the uncertainty of the future. They were no longer just a lucid whisper, a guardian of the dreamscapes, but something more. They had become a symbol, not only for the people of Dormiria, but for the delicate balance between creation and destruction. They had come to understand that it was not about rejecting one for the other, but about holding them both in tandem. It was this balance that had allowed them to fight against the Harbinger, to bring peace to a shattered realm, and to emerge as something both stronger and more fragile than they had been before. Reverie's fractured nature, once a curse, had become a part of their identity. They had come to terms with the darkness that lived within them, the abyss that had been a part of their very being since the beginning. But it no longer controlled them. They had learned to weave the light and the shadow together, to use both in harmony. It was a constant struggle, a delicate dance, but it was one they could now navigate with awareness and resolve. As they walked through the city, the people of Dormiria greeted them with nods, some with smiles, others with silent respect. Reverie's heart swelled with both pride and sorrow. They had led Dormiria through the darkest times, and they had emerged from the other side. But the journey was far from over. Dormiria had been saved, but it was still healing. There were still cracks in the dreamscapes, still wounds to mend. The path ahead was uncertain, and there was no guarantee that the balance they had fought so hard to achieve would be preserved. But Reverie had come to understand that uncertainty was not a burden. It was simply part of the journey. The future could not be predicted or controlled. All they could do was move forward, carrying the lessons of the past with them, and striving to protect what mattered most. The dreamscape was ever-shifting, and so were they. It was a cycle that had no true end, but that did not mean it was without meaning. They paused at the edge of a familiar garden, now overgrown, but still beautiful in its quiet chaos. It had been a place of solace for them in the past, and now it stood as a symbol of what could be rebuilt. The flowers that had once wilted under the weight of the Harbinger's influence had bloomed again, fragile but vibrant. In their own way, they mirrored Reverie's own journey, growing in the aftermath of destruction, finding new life in the spaces where they had once been broken. The wind carried a soft whisper, as if the dreamscape itself was speaking to them. Reverie closed their eyes, listening to the song of the world around them, the hum of creation, the pulse of life, the quiet beat of existence. And for the first time in a long while, they felt at peace. They had learned to accept their fractured nature, to embrace the parts of themselves that were both light and shadow. They no longer feared the darkness within them. They understood that it was not something to be destroyed, but something to be acknowledged and respected. In accepting both their creation and their destruction, Reverie had become something new, something whole, in a way they had never thought possible. I am both light and shadow, Reverie whispered to the wind, the words more a declaration to themselves than anything else. And that is enough. The world around them shifted in response, the dreamscape alive with possibility. There was no final destination, no perfect form to reach, only the constant evolution of self and the realm they protected. Reverie no longer saw themselves as a broken soul, torn between light and darkness. They were both, and in that duality they had found their strength. As the sun set over Dormiria, casting long shadows across the land, Reverie knew that their journey had only just begun. The future was uncertain, yes, but they were no longer afraid of it. They would face whatever came with the same balance they had fought so hard to achieve, walking the line between creation and destruction, between light and shadow, knowing that their fractured nature was not a weakness, but the very source of their strength. They turned away from the garden, walking into the heart of Dormiria, ready to continue the work that lay ahead. The road would be long, but it was theirs to walk. With each step, Reverie embraced the truth that had always been within them. They were a dreamweaver, a protector, and a keeper of balance. And as long as they remained true to that purpose, they would always find their way. You've just heard Mistwoven Legends, The Fractured Dreamer, Book 4 of Mistwoven Legends series, brought to you by Audible Archives. Reverie has carried Dormiria through its greatest trial yet, but leadership is a burden carved in sacrifice, and balance is never won without scars. From creation to destruction, from hope to despair, they have embraced their fractured nature. I'm Nayara, your host, and if this journey gripped you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Because though this chapter has closed, the dream of Dormiria will linger, waiting to rise again in the minds of those who listen.